Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India. By Shashi Tharoor. Audiobook presented by the Learner's Library. Contents. Chapter 3. Democracy, the Press, the Parliamentary System and the Rule of Law. Chapter 4. Divide et Impera. Chapter 3. Democracy, the Press, the Parliamentary System and the Rule of Law. A good part of the British case for having created India's political unity and democracy lies in the evolution of three of democracy's building blocks during the colonial era: a free press, an incipient parliamentary system, and the rule of law. This trifecta, which India retains and has continued to develop in its own ways, existed in the colonial era, but with significant distortions, and is therefore worth examining. At the high noon of the early 21st century imperial hubris, with America poised to invade Iraq, Russia in retreat, the Taliban in disarray, and bin Laden in hiding, and the currents of globalization flowing strongly, and seemingly irresistibly, around the world, the controversial Scottish historian Neil Ferguson published Empire: How Britain Made the World, which saw in the past all the virtues he wished to celebrate in the present. The British, Ferguson wrote, combined commerce, conquest, and some evangelical imperialism, in an early form of globalization, or, in a particularly infelicitous word, Anglobalization, and in so doing, Britain bequeathed to a large part of the world 9 of its most distinctive and admirable features, the very ones that had made Britain great: the English language, English forms of land tenure, Scottish and English banking, the common law, Protestantism, team sports, the night watchman estate, representative assemblies, and the idea of liberty. The last of these, he tells us, is the most distinctive feature of the empire, since, whenever the British were behaving despotically, there was always a liberal critique of that behavior from within British society. We shall return to the broader elements of Ferguson's analysis, and that of other apologists for empire like Lawrence James, in Chapter 5, but it is the claims to liberal democracy that detain us now. Ferguson is uncompromising. India, the world's largest democracy, owes more than it is fashionable to acknowledge to British rule. Its elite schools, its universities, its civil service, its army, its press, and its parliamentary system all still have discernibly British models. Without the influence of British imperial rule, he adds, it is hard to believe that the institutions of parliamentary democracy would have been adopted by the majority of states in the world, as they are today. As befits an economic historian, Ferguson contends, in a later thesis that ventures beyond India, that empire not only underwrites the free international exchange of commodities, labor, and capital but also creates and upholds the conditions without which markets cannot function: peace and order, the rule of law, non-corrupt administration, stable fiscal and monetary policies, as well as provide public goods, such as transport infrastructure, hospitals, and schools, which would not otherwise exist. The liberalism of empire means that those who become its subjects gain greatly from their subjection, and this, to Ferguson, proves that empire benefits the colonized as well as the imperial center. British rule in India is one of Ferguson's exhibits for this thesis, and in this, as in the previous and the next chapter, we shall examine the actual record of Britain in advancing the much-vaunted elements of liberal democracy so often cited by Raj apologists. The partly free press. Apologists for Britain, and many critics, tend to give the empire credit for introducing the concept of the free press to India, starting the first newspapers and promoting a consciousness of the rights a free citizen was entitled to enjoy. It is certainly true that Indian nationalism and the independence movement could not have spread across the country without the active involvement of the free press. Although the first printing press was introduced to the subcontinent by the Portuguese in 1330, it only printed books, as indeed did the first British printing press, established in Bombay in 1664. It took more than a century for the first newspaper to be printed in India when, in 1580, James Augustus Hickey published his Bengal Gazette, or Calcutta General Advertiser. But the East India Company soon looked askance at his inconvenient views and, after 2 years of mounting exasperation, seized his press in 1582. This did not, however, dissuade others less contentious in manner than Hickey, and soon a raft of British newspapers began printing in India, the first 4 in the company capital of Calcutta: the Calcutta Gazette in 1584, the Bengal Journal and the Oriental Magazine of Calcutta in 1583, and the Calcutta Chronicle in 1586, and then 2 in the other principal British trading centres: the Madras Courier in 1588 and the Bombay Herald in 1589. These newspapers all reflected the interests of the small European community, particularly commercial interests, and provided useful, if not always accurate, information about the arrivals and departures of ships and developments in the governance of the colony. They did establish a newspaper culture in British India, however, and though none of the initial newspapers survived, it was soon apparent that the press was here to stay. Alarmed by their proliferation, and concerned that the company's critics and enemies, including conceivably the French, could use the press to the company's disadvantage, Lord Wellesley introduced the Censorship of the Press Act, 1599, which brought all newspapers in India under the scrutiny of the Government of India prior to publication. This act was later extended in 1805 to cover all kinds of publications, newspapers, magazines, books, and pamphlets. Some of the more obstreperous publications were closed down: the editors of Indian World, Bengal Gazette, and Calcutta Journal were even arrested and deported to England for their intemperate criticism of company officials and policies. It was not a propitious beginning for the idea of a free press in India. The draconian restrictions were eased soon enough, as the company established its stranglehold over India and the threats to it from European rivals disappeared. The growing independence of the press in the mother country also began to be reflected in India. While many of the early newspapers faded away, sometimes with the death or departure of their publishers, sometimes because they were not commercially viable given their small readership base, and sometimes because the editors and staff simply ran out of enthusiasm for their task and adequate replacements could not be found, others not only survived but established a considerable following. The Times of India, established in Bombay in 1838, and the Calcutta Statesman, which began life in 1853 but incorporated the Friend of India, which was founded in 1818, soon established themselves as reliable pillars of the establishment, solidly committed to British imperial interests but able to criticize the policies and actions of the government in a responsible manner. As the British expanded across northern India, the Pioneer established itself in Lucknow as the third in a colonial triumvirate of newspapers whose views could be taken as broadly representative of the British community in India. It must, therefore, be acknowledged that it was the British who first established newspapers in India, which had been unknown before colonial rule, and it is to their credit that they allowed Indians to emulate them in doing so both in English, catering to the tiny English-educated elite, and its aspirational imitators, and in Indian vernacular languages. The Bombay Samakar, in Gujarati, was founded in 1822, it is still running, and proudly calls itself the oldest newspaper in Asia still in print, and a few decades later, two Bengali-owned newspapers followed suit in Calcutta, the Bengali in 1859, later purchased, and edited for 37 years, by Surendra Nath Banerjee after he left the ICS, and the formidable Amrita Bazar Patrika in 1868, which, after being founded as a Bengali language publication, then became a bilingual weekly for a time, before turning into an English-language newspaper in 1858 to advocate nationalist interests. The Amrita Bazar Patrika became a formidable pro-Congress voice and survived till the late 20th century, before closing in 1986. Other English-language, Indian-owned newspapers addressed themselves to Indian readers but in the awareness that their views would be paid attention to by the colonial authorities. This made them increasingly influential in the freedom movement. Arguably the most notable of these was the Hindu in Madras, established as a weekly in 1858 and converted into a daily from 1889, which the British came to regard for a long time as the voice of responsible Indian opinion. The Hindu's first issue counted a grand total of 80 copies, printed with 1 rupee and 8 annas of borrowed money by a group of 4 law students and 2 teachers. In the early 20th century, Indian nationalists began to establish newspapers explicitly to advocate their cause. The best of these were the Bombay Chronicle, founded by former Congress President Sir Fairoz Mehta in 1910, Hindustan Times, which was started by the Congress-supporting Birla business family in 1924, and Jawaharlal Nehru's own National Herald, which started publication in 1938. The Muslim League followed suit, when its political fortunes picked up during the war years, Muhammad Ali Jinnah establishing Dawn in Karachi and Delhi in 1941. By 1853, it was estimated that there were 453 newspapers in India, the vast majority owned and edited by Indians. They catered to the literate minority, less than 10% of the population at that time, but their influence extended well beyond this segment, since the news and views they published were repeated and spread by word of mouth. The nascent library movement in India also helped, as did public reading rooms, and each copy sold enjoyed at least a dozen readers. Though the newspapers were printed and published in the big cities, editions made their way, sometimes 3 days later, to the rural areas and Mufassal district, non-metropolitan towns, where they were eagerly awaited and avidly read. There is no doubt that the press contributed significantly to the development and growth of nationalist feelings in India, inculcated the idea of a broader public consciousness, exposed many of the failings of the colonial administration, and played an influential part in fomenting opposition to many aspects of British rule. Inevitably, the British authorities began to be alarmed. Lord Lytton brought in a Vernacular Press Act in 1858 to regulate the Indian language papers, and his government kept a jaundiced eye on the English-language ones. It was the introduction of this act that prompted the Amrita Bazar Patrika to convert itself into an English-language newspaper overnight, to avoid coming under the new law's purview. Still, outright censorship and repression would not have gone down well with the British public at home, and the authorities had to tread warily. While on certain occasions of grave danger to Britain, especially at times of war, and during periods of elevated nationalist resistance, the press was directly curtailed to protect imperial interests. The Rowlatt Acts come to mind. A wide range of criticism of British administration was permitted most of the time. Indeed, the Indian vernacular press was allowed to get away with crude invective. For instance, in 1889, a Bengali newspaper, Halashahar Patrika, colorfully described the British Lieutenant Governor Sir George Campbell as the baboon Campbell with a hairy body. His eyes flash forth in anger and his tail is all in flames. But had its anti-colonialism taken on a more explicitly political tone, for instance in questioning the very premises of British rule at all or calling for its overthrow, the authorities would not have been quite as tolerant. One of the most notable accomplishments of the Indian nationalist media, during a period of relative freedom, ironically has implications that haunt the subcontinent even today. In 1891, a journalist from the Amrita Bazar Patrika managed to rummage through the wastepaper basket at the office of Viceroy Lord Lansdowne. There he found the fragments of a torn-up letter, which with great enterprise he managed to piece together. The letter contained explosive news, revealing as it did in considerable detail the Viceroy's plans to annex the Hindu Maharaja-ruled Muslim-majority state of Jammu and Kashmir. To the consternation of the British authorities, Amrita Bazar Patrika published the letter on its front page. The cat was out of the bag. The newspaper reached the Maharaja of Kashmir, who promptly protested, set sail for London, and vehemently lobbied the authorities there to honor their predecessors' guarantees of his state's independent status. The Maharaja was successful, and Indian nationalists congratulated the Patrika on having thwarted the colonialists' imperial designs. Had this exposé not taken place, Kashmir would not have remained a princely state, free to choose the country, and the terms of its accession upon independence in 1945, it would have been a province of British India, subject to being carved up by a careless British pen during partition. The contours of the Kashmir problem would have looked very different today. Nonetheless, the Lansdowne Patrika episode was an exception. For much of the time, the Indian media operated under severe constraints. The Revised Press Act of 1910 was designed to limit the influence of editors on public opinion. It became a key instrument of British control of the Indian press. Under its provisions, an established press or newspaper had to provide a security deposit of up to 5,000 rupees, a considerable sum in those days. A new publication would have to pay up to 2,000. If the newspaper printed something of which the government disapproved, the money could be forfeit, the press closed down, and its proprietors and editors prosecuted. The Congress leader Annie Besant, for instance, had refused to pay a security on a paper she published advocating Home Rule, and was arrested for failing to do so and thereby violating the act. It is noteworthy that only Indian publications were vulnerable to forfeiting the substantial bond they had posted with the authorities, if they failed their undertaking not to publish inflammatory or abusive articles. The racism of the British-owned press was never subject to similar strictures. The British colonial governments in the provinces enjoyed the right to search any newspaper's premises and confiscate any material they found seditious. The Indian press, in other words, was fettered rather than free, but that it existed, and could serve as a rallying point for public opinion, is to the credit of both the British authorities and the Indians who worked in the media. Indian papers, especially the vernacular ones which tended to be less restrained in their abuse of the colonial masters, were fined, suppressed, and shut down. Their editors were frequently imprisoned, and several times given 23 months of hard labor for a piece of invective, and under the Press Act, their stock of type, without which they could not print, was liable to confiscation. But such threats were never focused on the pro-imperialist British papers in India. In no Indian newspaper, wrote the fair-minded British observer, Henry Neville's son, in 1908, have I seen more deliberate attempts to stir up race hatred and incite to violence than in Anglo-Indian, i.e., British settlers, papers, which suffer nothing. Neville's son offers as an example this obvious instigation to indiscriminate Manslaughter by the Asian, an Anglo-Indian weekly in Calcutta, May 9, 1908. Mr. Kingsford, a British magistrate in Calcutta whose court was the target of a bomb, has a great opportunity, and we hope he is a fairly decent shot at short range. We recommend to his notice a Mauser pistol, with the nickel filed off the nose of the bullets, or a Colt's automatic, which carries a heavy soft bullet and is a hard-hitting and punishing weapon. We hope Mr. Kingsford will manage to secure a big bag, and we envy him his opportunity. He will be more than justified in letting daylight into every strange native approaching his house or his person, and for his own sake we trust he will learn to shoot fairly straight without taking his weapon out of his coat pocket. It saves time and gives the elevation fairly correctly at any distance up to about 10 or 15 yards. We wish the one man who has shown that he has a correct view of the necessities of the situation the very best of luck. Nevinson adds that the tone of the Anglo-Indian press is almost invariably insolent and provocative. If seditious only means likely to lead to violence, it is seditious too. The press, in other words, was free, but some newspapers, the British-owned ones, were freer than others. The parliamentary system in India by the time of independence, British India, and many other British colonies, had elections, parties, a more or less free press, and the rule of law, unlike their Spanish, Portuguese, French, Dutch, and Belgian counterparts. Democratization may have been slow, grudging, and gradual, but it was also more successful in the ex-British colonies than elsewhere. The Indian nationalist struggle and its evolution through various stages, decorous liberals seeking legislative rights, extremists clamoring for Swaraj, Gandhi and his followers advocating nonviolent struggle, the Congress, the Muslim League, and other parties contending for votes even with limited franchise. All these pre-independence experiences served as a kind of socialization process into democracy, and helped to ease the country's transition to independence. It is remarkable that when the Indian nationalists, victorious in their freedom struggle, sat down to write a constitution for independent India, they created a political system based entirely on British parliamentary democracy. Was this simply because they had seen it from afar and been denied access to it themselves, and so wanted a replica of Westminster in India, or might it be that the British, through the power of example, actually convinced Indians that theirs was a system worth emulating? A digression here. Personally, I am far from convinced that the British system is suited to India. The parliamentary democracy we have adopted involves the British perversity of electing a legislature to form an executive. This has created a unique breed of legislator, largely unqualified to legislate, who has sought election only in order to wield, or influence, executive power. It has produced governments obliged to focus more on politics than on policy or performance. It has distorted the voting preferences of an electorate that knows which individuals it wants but not necessarily which policies. It has spawned parties that are shifting alliances of individual interests rather than the vehicles of coherent sets of ideas. It has forced governments to concentrate less on governing than on staying in office, and obliged them to cater to the lowest common denominator of their coalitions. It is time for a change. Pluralist democracy is India's greatest strength, but its current manner of operation is the source of its major weaknesses. India's many challenges require political arrangements that permit decisive action, whereas they increasingly promote drift and indecision. India must have a system of government whose leaders can focus on governance rather than on staying in power. The parliamentary system has not merely outlived any good it could do, it was from the start unsuited to Indian conditions, and is primarily responsible for many of the nation's principal political ills. This is why I have repeatedly advocated a presidential system for India, not just for the federal government in New Delhi, but a system of directly elected chief executives at the levels of villages, towns, states, and the center, elected for fixed terms and accountable to the voters every 5 years, rather than to the caprices of legislatures and the shifting majorities of municipal councils or village panchayats, councils. The parliamentary system devised in Britain, a small island nation with electorates initially of a few thousand voters per MP, and even today fewer than 100,000 voters per constituency, assumes a number of conditions that simply do not exist in India. It requires the existence of clearly defined political parties, each with a coherent set of policies and preferences that distinguish it from the next, whereas in India, a party is all too often a label of convenience that a politician adopts and discards as frequently as a Bollywood film star changes costume. The principal parties, whether national or otherwise, are fuzzily vague about their beliefs. Every party's ideology is one variant or another of centrist populism, derived to a greater or lesser degree from the Nehruvian socialism of the Congress. But we cannot blame the British for saddling us with this system, though it is their mother of parliaments our forefathers sought to emulate. First of all, the British had no intention of imparting democracy to Indians. Second, Indians freely chose the parliamentary system themselves in a constituent assembly. Like the American revolutionaries of 2 centuries ago, Indian nationalists had fought for the rights of Englishmen, which they thought the replication of the Houses of Parliament would both epitomize and guarantee. When former British Prime Minister Clement Attlee, as a member of a British Constitutional Commission, suggested the U.S. presidential system as a model to Indian leaders, he recalled, they rejected it with great emphasis. I had the feeling that they thought I was offering them margarine instead of butter. Many of our veteran parliamentarians, several of whom had been educated in England and watched British parliamentary traditions with admiration, reveled in their adherence to British parliamentary convention and complimented themselves on the authenticity of their ways. Indian MPs still thumped their desks in approbation, rather than applauding by clapping their hands. When bills are put to a vote, an affirmative call is still aye, rather than yes. Even our communists have embraced the system with great delight. An Anglophile Marxist MP, Professor Hiren Mukherjee, used to assert proudly that British Prime Minister Anthony Eden had felt more at home during question hour in the Indian Parliament than in the Australian. But 6 decades of independence have wrought significant change, as exposure to British practices has faded and India's natural boisterousness has reasserted itself. Some of the state assemblies in our federal system have already witnessed scenes of furniture overthrown, microphones ripped out and slippers flung by unruly legislators, not to mention fisticuffs and garments torn in scuffles among politicians. Pepper spray has been unleashed by a protesting member of parliament in the well of the national legislature. We can scarcely blame the British for that either. And yet the argument that Britain left us with self-governing institutions and the trappings of democracy fails to hold water, in the face of the reality of colonial repression. Let me cite one individual who actually lived through the colonial experience, Jawaharlal Nehru, who wrote in a 1936 letter to an Englishman, Lord Lothian, that British rule is based on an extreme form of widespread violence and the only sanction is fear. It suppresses the usual liberties which are supposed to be essential to the growth of a people, it crushes the adventurous, the brave, the sensitive, and encourages the timid, the opportunist and time-serving, the sneak and the bully. It surrounds itself with a vast army of spies and informers and agents provocateurs. Is this the atmosphere in which the more desirable virtues grow or democratic institutions flourish? Nehru went on to speak of the crushing of human dignity and decency, the injuries to the soul as well as the body, which degrades those who use it as well as those who suffer from it. These were hardly ways of instilling or promoting respect for democracy and its principles in India. This injury to India's soul, the very basis of a nation's self-respect, is what is always overlooked by apologists for colonialism. Rule of law, the boot and the spleen. A corollary of the argument that Britain gave India political unity and democracy is that it established the rule of law in the country. This was, in many ways, central to the British self-conception of imperial purpose. We have noted earlier other aspects of what the British saw as their mission in India. Bringing British law to the natives was arguably one of the most important constituent elements of this mission. Kipling would wax eloquent on the noble duty to bring law to those without it. The British both laid down the law and derived legitimacy, in their own eyes and in those of the world, from doing so. It was, of course, through the law that British authority was exercised, but where a system of laws pre-existed the British legal system, as was the case in India, British law had to be imposed upon an older and more complex civilization with its own legal culture, and here the Kipling-esque arguments began to fray at the edges. In India, the British were forced to use coercion and cruelty to get their way. Often they had to resort to the dissolution of prior practices and traditional systems, as well as, in the process, to reshape civil society. In the circumstances, as a British scholar has noted, the law that was erected can hardly be said to have served the interests of colonial subjects. Pride of place to the legacy of British imperialism in India is often given to the empire giving India its penal code, drafted by Macaulay with the avowed purpose of legislating for a conquered race, to whom the blessings of our constitution cannot as yet be safely extended. Macaulay sat for 3 years behind high walls, completely disconnected from the people he was ostensibly working for, and created a code of criminal law that was a body of jurisprudence written for everyone and no one, which had no relationship to previous Indian laws or any other form of government at all. Even the British were uncertain about his effort, and Macaulay's penal code sat unenacted for 24 years after he finished it in 1835. Finally enacted in 1861, it is still largely in force in India today, in all its Victorian glory. In addition, the British introduced their ideas of trial by jury, freedom of expression and due process of law. These are incontestable legal values, except in their actual manner of working, for in its application during the colonial era, the rule of law was not exactly impartial. Justice, in British India, was far from blind, it was highly attentive to the skin color of the defendant. Crimes committed by whites against Indians attracted minimal punishment. An Englishman who shot dead his Indian servant got 6 months jail time and a modest fine, then about 100 rupees, while an Indian convicted of attempted rape against an Englishwoman was sentenced to 20 years rigorous imprisonment. Only a handful of Englishmen were convicted of murder in India in the first 130 years of British rule. The death of an Indian at British hands was always an accident, and that of a Briton because of an Indian's actions always a capital crime. Indian judges also suffered racial discrimination, as we have seen with the case of Justice Syed Mahmood. When Lord Ripon, the only humane, non-racist viceroy sent to India in the 19th century, attempted to allow Indian judges to try British defendants and to play a stronger role in municipal matters, through the Ilbert Bill, the backlash was severe. His aides protested that it would hardly subvert the British Empire to allow the Bengali Babu to discuss his own schools and drains. But neither courts nor municipalities were acceptable terrain for Indian participation as far as the British were concerned. Ripon was boycotted by British expatriates, and the racist outcry resulted in the collapse of the Ilbert Bill, and Ripon's premature removal from office. A certain type of case popped up frequently in the British colonial courts. Many Indians suffered from enlarged spleens as a result of malaria, or other diseases, when a British master kicked a native servant in the stomach, a not uncommon form of conduct in those days. The Indian's enlarged spleen would rupture, causing his death. The jurisprudential question was, did the fatal kick amount to murder or criminal misconduct? When Robert Augustus Fuller fatally assaulted his servant in these circumstances in 1853, Fuller claimed he struck him on the face, but 3 witnesses testified that he had kicked him in the stomach. He was found guilty only of voluntarily causing hurt, and was sentenced to 15 days imprisonment or a fine of 30 rupees to be paid to the widow. According to the coroner, the servant's spleen was so enlarged that even moderate violence would have ruptured it. In the middle of the hot night, wrote Captain Stanley de Vere Julius in his 1903 notes on striking natives, the fan stops, and a man in the barrack room, roused to desperation by heat and sleeplessness, rushes forth, careless of the consequences, and kicks the fan puller in the wrong spot, his spleen. Do you blame him? Yes and no. It depends partly on whether he stopped to put his boots on. Punch wrote an entire ode to the stout British boot, as the favored instrument of keeping the natives in order. It ended, "Let us sing, let us shout for the leather-shod foot, and inscribe on our banners, the stout British boot." The disinclination of British judges in India to find any Englishman guilty of murdering any Indian was curiously mirrored in a recorded decline in murder charges in Victorian London. Martin Weiner proposed an export model. The murder rate had dropped in Britain, he suggested, because the most aggressive citizens were busily wreaking havoc overseas. It helped, of course, that fatal kicking in London was handled as willful murder, whereas in India it would only be charged as causing hurt or committing a rash and negligent act, provided the victim was an Indian. There was, it is true, a threat of terrorism from Indian nationalists in the early years of the 20th century that may have influenced judges in deciding cases of white violence against natives. But most of the Indian deaths at European hands involved servants or other menials rather than Swadeshi bomb throwers, and their cases were unrelated to political terrorism. Still, circumstances could always be stretched to extenuate the murderous conduct of an Englishman. When an Indian boy was shot dead by Lieutenants Thompson and Neve in Bangalore and Indian villagers forcibly confiscated Neve's gun, it was 2 of the villagers who were sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment for the crime of misappropriating the white man's weapon, whereas the murderers went unpunished. Indeed, the case was filed as an incident of natives against Europeans. Sentences handed down by British judges were never equal for Indians and Europeans. In Calcutta, it was estimated that Indian prisoners' sentences exceeded those for Europeans by a factor of 10 for the same crimes. Indian defendants were more than twice as likely as European ones to face murder or attempted murder charges for violent crimes. Statistically, European assaults on Indians were far more frequent than those by Indians on Europeans, yet almost all of the latter were charged as murder, whereas most European misdeeds were deemed to be either accidental or in self-defense, and were in any case downgraded from murder to assault. In one case in which a British judge found evidence that a crime was clearly murder, the British killer was found insane and hence not responsible for his actions. Not all the British were equally comfortable with this form of justice. In I-902, when 3 troopers of the 9th Lancers beat to death an Indian man in Sialkot for refusing to bring them a woman for the night, regimental authorities made no effort to investigate, and they tried to get away by painting the victim as a drunkard. But the incident outraged a sizable number of Britons living in India. Even the Viceroy, Lord Curzon, who was no lover of Indians, was horrified enough to declare, "I will not be a party to any scandalous hushings up of bad cases of which there is too much in this country, or to the theory that a white man may kick or batter a black man to death with impunity because he is only a amni, nigger." Curzon could not increase the punishment, but he had the entire British regiment involved transferred to Aden. Still, he was forced to watch stonily at a parade in Delhi a few weeks later, as the English sections of the crowd cheered the same regiment wildly as it marched past. If Curzon, of all people, was moved to make a statement sympathetic to Indians, one can imagine the scale of the problem. One scholar, Jordana Bailkin, points out that there were a few, though very few, exceptions to this norm of race-conscious justice. In 3 rare cases, Britons were executed for killing Indians: John Rudd in Bengal, I-86I, for sailors named Wilson, Apostle, Nicholas, and Peters in Bombay, I-865, and George Nairns in Bengal, I-880. But in 200 years of British rule, and thousands of cases in which Indians died at the hands of their colonial masters, these 3 cases were the only exceptions. Generally speaking, British civilian judges and upcountry magistrates were reluctant to punish Europeans, whereas military courts and urban high courts were willing to impose relatively more serious punishments for attacks on Indians. In the view of an ICS officer, who served 30 years in the late 19th century, there is a great and dangerous gap between the people and the courts, and there is no way of bridging it. The moderate nationalist Prabhat magazine, in its issue of December I-923, writing after the exoneration and acquittal of an Englishman for kicking an Indian to death, lamented, "The answer to why Indians are dissatisfied with the sick British rule is to be found in such incidents. Such painful disregard for Indian life cannot help but produce a deep impression upon the heart of every Indian, and no wonder that, despite Mahatma Gandhi's insistent advice regarding non-violence, revolutionary conspiracies are heard of in misguided India. So long as this relation exists between the boot and the spleen, India will be the most untouchable and degraded country in the world." The imperial system of law was created by a foreign race and imposed upon a conquered people who had never been consulted in its creation. It was, pure and simple, an instrument of colonial control. As Henry Nevinson also pointed out, the rule of law, such as it was, functioned in a system in which Indians were compelled to live permanently under a system of official surveillance that reads their private letters, detains their telegrams, and hires men to watch their actions. This, then, was the rule of law the British taught us. We have much to unlearn. There were other problems. The colonial rule of law generally worked in favor of white settlers, elites, and men. Racial discrimination was legal, as we have seen, in addition to private clubs that were open only to whites. Many British hotels and other establishments sported signs saying, "Indians and dogs not allowed." It was the experience of being expelled from one of them, Watson's Hotel in Bombay, that led Jamsetji Tata to build one of the world's finest and most opulent hotels of its time, the Taj Mahal, which was open to Indians. Women were treated with Victorian paternalism and not a little misogyny. Institutionally, for instance, women on the Malabar coast who benefited from matrilineal law and enjoyed vast property and social rights, not to speak of bodily autonomy, were pushed to accept patriarchal shackles as the correct and moral way of living and subject themselves to husbands and sons, physically, socially, and economically. Southern Indian women, whose breasts were traditionally uncovered, found themselves obliged to undergo the indignity of conforming to Victorian standards of morality. Soon the right to cover one's breasts became a marker of upper caste respectability, and efforts were made to deny this privilege to lower caste women, leading to such missionary-inspired colonial curiosities as the breast cloth agitation from 1813 to 1839, in Travancore and the Madras Presidency. India's rape law, enshrined in the colonial-era Indian Penal Code, placed the burden on the victim to establish her good character and prove that a rape had occurred, which left her open to discredit by opposing counsel. Many rapes were never reported as a result of the humiliation to which this system subjected the victims. Since the rule of law was intended to perpetuate the British hold over India, it was designed as an instrument of imperial rule. Political dissidence was legally repressed through various acts. The Penal Code contained 49 articles on crimes relating to dissent against the state, and only 11 on crimes involving death. The racism of the colonial state was also reflected in its penal code. The Criminal Tribes Legislation, 1911, gave authority to the British to restrict movement, search and even detain people from specific groups, because their members were deemed to be chronically engaging in criminal activity. This was bad sociology and worse law, but it stayed on the books till after independence. Worse, its effects were inhumane. The scholar Sanjay Nigam's work has shown how the British invention of the notion of criminal tribes, and their passing legislation to confirm this categorization, led to the collection of intrusive records of personal details, restrictions on the movement of members of these tribes, forcible relocation of people belonging to criminal tribes to rural settlements or reformatory camps, and the deliberate separation of children from their parents. Of course, the court system, the penal code, the respect for jurisprudence, and the value system of justice, even if they were not applied fairly to Indians in the colonial era, are all worthy legacies, and Indians are glad to have them. But in the process Britain has saddled us with an adversarial legal system, excessively bogged down in procedural formalities, which is far removed from India's traditional systems of justice. There is no doubt that traditional systems like the Kap Panchayats, caste or village councils, of the north had severe limitations of their own and were often used to uphold an iniquitous social order, but as Rwanda has shown with its Gacaca courts, traditional systems can be adapted to meet modern norms of justice without the excessive procedural delays, formalism, and expense of the Western system. The colonial legacy has meant a system of interminable trials and long pending cases, leaving India with an unenviable world record for judicial backlog that exceeds by far every other country in the world. There are still cases pending, in some of India's lower courts, which were filed in the days of the British Raj. Non-interference or manipulation. Part of the argument for the benevolence of British colonialism is that the British were, beyond a point, largely non-intrusive rulers with no desire to interfere in the local affairs of the Indian population, who believed that India's traditions and customs, however abhorrent and primitive they might be, must be respected. As the Queen's Proclamation of 1838 plainly put it, "We declare it our royal will and pleasure that none be molested or disquieted, by reason of their religious faith or observances, but that all shall alike enjoy the equal and impartial protection of the law, and we do strictly charge and enjoin all those who may be in authority under us that they abstain from all interference with the religious belief or worship of any of our subjects on pain of our highest displeasure." Since the British were not motivated by either the crusading Christianity of the Spanish or the cultural zeal of the French, but merely by pecuniary greed, they were not unduly anxious to transform Indian society or shape it in their image. It is true enough that British racism was accentuated by convictions of Christian superiority, as William Wilberforce, Britain's most famous evangelical Christian, put it, "Our religion is sublime, pure, and beneficent. Theirs is mean, licentious, and cruel." For many Britons, imperialism was principally justified as a moral crusade to liberate Indians from ignorance, idolatry, and vice. But they were curiously reluctant to act on it. Whereas the Portuguese rapidly Christianized Goa, for instance, the British did not import their first bishop till 1813. The first, and often the only, purpose of British power in India, writes John Wilson, was to defend the fact of Britain's presence on Indian ground. For most of the imperialists, India was a career, not a crusade. Changing India was not the object, making money out of India was. As Angus Maddison observes, there were no major changes in village society, in the caste system, the position of untouchables, the joint family system, or in production techniques in agriculture. He was not entirely right. In fact, as we shall see, the caste system became more rigid under the British than it had been in pre-colonial India. Yet the British also claim credit for ending the barbarous practices of sati, or sati, the self-immolation of widows on their husbands' funeral pyres, made even more grotesque by the fact that many of the victims were young girls married off to much older men, and thugji, ritual robbery and murder carried out in the name of goddess Kali by a bunch of criminals who gave the English language their collective epithet, the thugs. The fact is that the British interfered with social customs only when it suited them to do so. The gap between liberal principles of universalism and the actual colonial practice of justice and governance was vast. I address some of the more misguided claims of British social reforms later in the book. What I would like to say here is that the British would interfere with local practices when they were minded to, and desist otherwise, claiming great virtue in either course of conduct. In the process, while codifying the legal system and instituting an Indian penal code, the British have saddled India with colonial-era prejudices that they have long abandoned at home but which remain entrenched in India, causing untold misery to millions. A number of raging controversies in India in 2016, though seemingly unrelated, have brought into sharp focus the one element they have in common. They all relate to criminal offences codified in colonial-era British legislation that India has proved unable, or unwilling to outgrow. Among other things, and these are just a few examples, the Indian Penal Code, drafted by British imperial rulers in the mid-19th century, criminalizes homosexuality under Section 377, creates a crime of e-sedition, under which students shouting slogans have been arrested, and applies a double standard to the commission of adultery. The draconian concept of e-sedition was enacted as an offense in 1850 to suppress any criticism of British policies. Under Section 124A of the Indian Penal Code, any person who uses words, signs, or visible representation to excite disaffection against the government can be charged with sedition and potentially sentenced to life. This was explicitly justified by its proponents at the time on the grounds of restricting free speech in a subject state. One Briton spoke candidly in 1850 of needing a law to curb seditious offences not involving an absolute breach of the peace. In other words, no free speech for Indians. When the law was tightened further in 1898, to make it harsher than it was in England, the British Lieutenant Governor of Bengal admitted, It is clear that a sedition law which is adequate for a people ruled by a government of its own nationality and faith may be inadequate, or in some respects unsuited, for a country under foreign rule. Sedition was therefore explicitly intended as an instrument to terrorize Indian nationalists. Mahatma Gandhi was amongst its prominent victims. Seeing it applied in democratic India shocked many Indians. The arrest in February 2016 of students at New Delhi's Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, on charges of sedition, for raising anti-Indian slogans in the course of protests against the execution of the accomplice of a convicted terrorist, and the filing of a legal case against Amnesty International in August 2016 on the same charges, would not have been possible without the loose, colonially motivated wording of the law. Agreeing with the outrage against colonial-era provisions in the law, as a member of Parliament, I introduced bills in the lower house, seeking to amend these laws. I argued that the existence of these provisions on the statute books had made our penal code liable to misuse by the authorities in ways that infringed upon the constitutional right of Indians. My bill would allow an individual to be charged with sedition only when his words or actions directly result in the use of violence, or incitement to violence, or constitutes an offense that is punishable with imprisonment for life under the Indian Penal Code, like culpable homicide, murder, or rape. Mere words or signs criticizing the measures or administrative actions of the government will not constitute sedition. My objective is to promote the freedom of speech and the right to express dissent against the government, while ensuring safeguards against the use of words to incite violence, options that were not available to Indians under British rule. Similarly, Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, enacted in 1860, criminalizes carnal intercourse against the order of nature, a term so archaic that it would invite derision in most modern societies. There had never been a taboo against homosexuality in Indian culture and social practice, until the British Victorians introduced one. Section 377, insofar as it criminalizes consensual sexual acts of adults in private, violates the fundamental rights guaranteed under Article 21, life and liberty, including privacy and dignity, Article 14, equality before law, and Article 15, prohibition of discrimination, of the Constitution of Free India. My amendment to Section 377 would have decriminalized sex between consenting adults of any gender or orientation. Conservative MPs from the ruling BJP party, however, voted against its introduction in Parliament, prompting LGBT activists to move the Supreme Court, which has agreed to hear a curative review petition against its earlier judgment upholding the law. The judicial route may, indeed, offer a more effective way to overturn this iniquitous section of the Penal Code. 58 Indians have been arrested under Section 377 in just 2 years, 2014 and 2013, for actions performed in the privacy of their homes. That's 58 Indians too many. The irony is that in India there has always been a place for people of different gender identities and sexual orientations. Indian history and mythology reveal no example of prejudice against sexual difference. On the contrary, in the great epic the Mahabharata, the gender-changing Shikhandi killed Bhishma. The concept of the Ardhanarishwara imagined God as half man and half woman, prompting the movie star Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh in the 1980s, N.T. Rama Rao, to dress up as Ardhanarishwara and surprise his followers, an unusual, even eccentric, act that was still seen as very much in keeping with Indian traditions. Transgender people were recognized as a Napunsak gender in Vedic and Puranic literature and were given due importance. In India throughout history, and even in the Islamic courts during the Mughal era. The Jain texts recognized a broader concept of gender identity, by speaking about the idea of a psychological sex being different from that of a physical one. Unfortunately, the British drafted Indian Penal Code criminalized aspects of human behavior and human reality that in India had not previously been regarded as criminal or requiring legal sanction. Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code and the Criminal Tribes Act of 1851 target the transgender community, as well as the homosexual community. They violate the Indian ethos and the traditions of perhaps at least 2,000 years of Indian cultural practice, mythology, history, the Puranas, and Indian ways of living. Instead of India's traditional tolerance and live and let live, the British saddled the country with a colonial-era interpretation of what was good and right for Indians. It is ironic to see the self-appointed defenders of Bharatiya Sanskriti, traditional Vedic India, on the treasury benches now defending the worst prejudices of British Victorian morality. The Indian Penal Code is no easier on straight women than on gays. Section 497, criminalizing adultery, punishes extramarital relationships involving married women but not married men. A husband can prosecute his wife for adultery, and a man having sexual relations with his wife, but a woman cannot sue her husband for having an extramarital relationship, provided his partner is not underage or married. This double standard, exposed in a series of recent cases, again reflects Victorian values rather than 21st century ideas of morality. Ironically, in all three cases, the British have revised their own laws, so none of the offences they criminalised in India are illegal in Britain. One of the worst legacies of colonialism is that its ill effects outlasted the empire. I do not mean to blame the British alone for the persistence of these injustices. But the British enshrined these laws that have proved so difficult to amend. Strikingly, no less an eminence than India's head of state, President Pranab Mukherjee, chose the 150th anniversary of the Indian Penal Code to underscore the need for its thorough revision. Our criminal law, he declared, was largely enacted by the British to meet their colonial needs. It needed to be revised to reflect our contemporary social consciousness so that it could be a faithful mirror of a civilization underlining the fundamental values on which it rests. That Indians have not done this so far is, of course, hardly Britain's fault, but by placing iniquitous laws on the books, Britain has left behind an oppressive legacy. It is time for 21st century India to get the government out of the bedroom, where the British were unembarrassed to intrude. It is also past time to realize that the range of political opinion permissible in a lively and contentious democracy cannot be reconciled with the existence of a pernicious colonial sedition law. Chapter 4. Divide et Impera. If British claims to creating viable political institutions in India, a democratic spirit, an efficient bureaucracy, and the rule of law all seem hollow after the analysis in the previous chapter, it is their overarching assertion of having bequeathed India its political unity that underpins these claims. But while the events outlined above were occurring, another anti-democratic British project was coming to fruition that would discredit any credible view that the political unity of India was an objective of British colonialism. The sight of Hindu and Muslim soldiers rebelling together in 1857 and fighting side by side, willing to rally under the command of each other and pledge joint allegiance to the enfeebled Mughal monarch, had alarmed the British, who did not take long to conclude that dividing the two groups and pitting them against one another was the most effective way to ensure the unchallenged continuance of empire. As early as 1839, the then British governor of Bombay, Lord Elphinstone, advised London that divide et impera was the old Roman maxim, and it should be ours. He was not quite right. The term was coined not by the Romans but by Philip II of Macedonia, though some Roman conquerors followed its precepts. A few decades later, Sir John Strachey opined that the existence of hostile creeds among the Indian people was essential for our political position in India. Caste, race, and classification. The British had a particular talent for creating and exaggerating particularist identities and drawing ethnically based administrative lines in all their colonies. Scholars have theorized that this practice may have stemmed from the British horror of diluting their own idealized English identity, to which their colonial subjects were not allowed to aspire. In this respect, they were quite unlike the French, whose policy of cultural assimilation went so far that little African and Asian children could be found dutifully reciting Nos ancêtres les Gaulois, our ancestors the Gauls, in their schoolrooms in Senegal or Vietnam. Indians were always subjects, never citizens. Throughout the days of empire, no Indian could have presumed to say, "I am British," the way a French African was encouraged to say, "Je suis français." This tendency to separate was apparent in British attitudes from the start. Indeed, it had been evidenced in the only already white country the British colonized, Ireland. Instead of assimilating the Irish into the British race, they were subjugated by their new overlords. Intermarriage was forbidden, as was even learning the Irish language or adopting Irish modes of dress, and most Irish people were segregated beyond the pale. If the British could do that to a people who looked like them, they were inclined to do much worse to the darker-skinned peoples they conquered in India. While we have examined some aspects of this phenomenon in previous chapters, I would like to examine how they classified Indians into various immutable categories, especially those of caste and religion. Let us start by giving the British the benefit of the doubt and assuming that they might have been inclined to suspect that Indians, too, must be like them, and would like nothing more than to shield themselves behind their own identities. But the British effort to understand ethnic, religious, sectarian, and caste differences among their subjects inevitably became an exercise in defining, dividing, and perpetuating these differences. Thus colonial administrators regularly wrote reports and conducted censuses that classified their subjects, in ever more bewilderingly narrow terms, based on their language, religion, sect, caste, subcaste, ethnicity, and skin color. In the process of such categorization and classification, not only were ideas of community reified, but also entire new communities were created by people who had not consciously thought of themselves as particularly different from others around them. The American anthropologist Nicholas Dirks explains it lucidly: colonialism was made possible, and then sustained and strengthened, as much by cultural technologies of rule as it was by the more obvious and brutal modes of conquest that first established power on foreign shores. Colonialism was itself a cultural project of control. Colonial knowledge both enabled conquest and was produced by it, in certain important ways. Knowledge was what colonialism was all about. Cultural forms in societies newly classified as traditional were reconstructed and transformed by this knowledge, which created new categories and oppositions between colonizers and colonized, European and Asian, modern and traditional, West and East. As India was anthropologized in the colonial interest, a narrative about its social formation, its political capacity, and its civilizational inheritance began increasingly to tell the story of colonial inevitability, and of the permanence of British imperial rule. Bernard Cohn, a scholar of British colonialism in India, has argued that the British simultaneously misinterpreted and oversimplified the features they saw in Indian society, placing Indians into stereotypical boxes they defined and into which they were assigned in the name of ancient tradition. In the conceptual scheme which the British created to understand and to act in India, they constantly followed the same logic. They reduced vastly complex codes and their associated meanings to a few metonyms. Laws had to be translated into terms the British could understand and apply. A complicated, often chaotic, and always fluid society like India was redefined by the British to be a place of rules and orders. Once the British had defined to their own satisfaction what they construed as Indian rules and customs, then the Indians had to conform to these constructions. Such an exercise might not have been possible in a pre-modern era, where identities were looser and more fuzzy, and the difficulties of breaching distance and extending communications made it difficult to create a consciousness of identity beyond the merely local. The path-breaking writer and thinker on nationalism, Benedict Anderson, has convincingly pointed out that identities uniting large numbers of people could arise only after a certain technological level had been attained. It is not seriously disputed that the sharper articulation of identities encompassing broad communities is a relatively recent phenomenon, nor that such identities have been imagined and invented to a great extent, as Anderson famously postulated. The British ruled India just as this kind of identity creation was becoming possible, thanks to modern developments in transport and communication. Whereas the great Mughal Akbar might have used such technologies to fuse his diverse people together, the British used them to separate, classify, and divide. Some critics point out that the British can scarcely be blamed for the pre-existing divisions in Indian society, notably caste, which divided, and still divides, the majority Hindu population into mutually exclusive and often incompatible social stratifications. Fair enough, but it is also true that the British, knowingly or unknowingly, helped solidify and perpetuate the iniquities of the caste system. Since the British came from a hierarchical society with an entrenched class system, they instinctively tended to look for a similar one in India. They began by anatomizing Indian society into classes that they referenced as being primarily religious in nature. They then seized upon caste. But caste had not been a particularly stable social structure in the pre-British days, though there were, of course, variants across time and place. Caste had broadly been a mobile form of social organization constantly shaped and reinvented by the beliefs, the politics, and quite often the economic interests of the dominant men of the times. The British, however, promulgated the theory that caste hierarchy and discrimination influenced the workings of Indian society. This is arguably a very narrow definition of how Indian society actually functioned in the pre-British era, and it is thanks to colonial rule that it has now become conventional wisdom. In his seminal book Castes of Mind, Dirks has explained in detail how it was, under the British, that caste became a single term capable of expressing, organizing, and above all systematizing India's diverse forms of social identity, community, and organization. As the result of a concrete encounter with colonial modernity during 200 years of British domination, colonialism made caste what it is today. Dirks is critical of the British imperial role in the reification of caste, using their colonial power to affirm caste as the measure of all social things. In fact, caste, he says, was just one category among many others, one way of organizing and representing identity. Moreover, caste was not a single category or even a single logic of categorization, even for Brahmins, who were the primary beneficiaries of the caste idea. Regional, village, or residential communities, kinship groups, factional parties, chiefly contingents, political affiliations, and so on could both supersede caste as a rubric for identity and reconstitute the ways caste was organized. Under colonialism, caste was thus made out to be far more pervasive, far more totalizing, and far more uniform than it had ever been before. This Dirks sees as a core feature of the colonial power to shape knowledge of Indian society. Quite deliberately, he suggests, caste became the colonial form of civil society, or, in Partha Chatterjee's terms, the colonial argument for why civil society could not grow in India. It justified the denial of political rights to Indians, who were, after all, subjects, not citizens, and explained the unavoidable necessity of colonial rule. Scholars who have studied pre-colonial caste relations dismiss the idea that Varna, the classification of all castes into 4 hierarchical groups, with the Brahmins on top and even kings and warriors a notch beneath them, could conceivably represent a complete picture of reality. Kshatriya kings, for example, were never in practical terms subordinate to Brahmins, whom they employed, paid, patronized, heeded, or dismissed as they found appropriate at different times. Nor could such a simplistic categorization reasonably organize the social identities and relations of all Indians. Across the vast subcontinent, alternative identities, subcastes, clans, and other formulations also existed and flourished in different ways at different places. The idea of the fourfold caste order stretching across all of India and embracing its complex civilizational expanse was only developed, modern scholars assert with considerable evidence, under the peculiar circumstances of British colonial rule. The British either did not understand, or preferred to ignore, the basic fact that the system need not have worked as described in theory. The British punditocracy. In the late 18th century, when the East India Company was establishing its stranglehold on India, and its senior officials included some with a genuine interest in understanding the country, the British began to study the Shastras, or Sanskrit treatises covering law and much else besides, to develop a set of legal principles to help them adjudicate disputes in Indian civil society. Governor-General Warren Hastings hired 11 pundits, Brahmin scholars, to create what became known as the Code of Genta Laws or the Ordinations of the Pundits. As the British could not read or interpret the ancient Sanskrit texts, they asked their Brahmin advisors to create the code based on religious Indian texts and their knowledge of Indian customs. The resulting output was an Anglo-Brahminical text that arguably violated both in letter and spirit the actual practice, in letter, because it was imprecise regarding the originals, and in spirit, because the pundits took advantage of the assignment to favor their own caste, by interpreting and even creating sacrosanct customs that, in fact, had no shastric authority. This served to magnify the problem of caste hierarchy in the country. Prior to this, scholars argue, disputes in Indian civil society were settled by jati or biradri, caste or clan, i.e., a person's fate was decided within a community or clan by his own peers in accordance with their local traditions and values, and without needing approval from any higher caste authority. The pundits, instead of reflecting this widespread practice, cited doctrinal justifications from long-neglected texts to enshrine their status as the only authority figures, and most of the British took them at their word. Some had their doubts. The most learned of British Orientalists, William Jones, who in 1595 founded the Asiatic Society in Calcutta and served in the Supreme Court of Judicature, remarked, "I can no longer bear to be at the mercy of our pundits who deal out Hindu law as they please and make it at reasonable rates, when they cannot find it ready-made." But Jones died tragically young, and his wisdom was not replicated in his successors. It was evident from a cursory look at Indian society that actual social practices did not necessarily follow the official or Shastric code, but the ancient texts were now cited, and given an inflexibility they did not, in fact, possess, essentially to restrict the autonomy of society and so control it more easily in the name of religious authority. This served the interests of British policy, which explicitly sought to enumerate, categorize, and assess their colonial populations and resources for administrative purposes. Ethnic, social, caste, and racial classifications were conducted as part of an imperial strategy more effectively to impose and maintain British control over the colonized Indian population. The process also reaffirmed their initial conviction that the Brahmins, with their knowledge of the Vedas, were the most qualified and best suited as their intermediaries to rule India. The Brahmins enjoyed British patronage over other groups and began considering themselves above all other castes, whom the British, internalizing Brahmin prejudice, thought of as lower castes. The result was a remarkable preponderance of Brahmins in positions of importance in the British Raj. Brahmins, who were no more than a tenth of the population, occupied over 90% of the positions available to Indians in government service, except the most menial ones. They dominated the professions open to Indians, especially lawyering and medicine, and they entered journalism and academia, so it was their voices that were heard loudest as the voices of Indian opinion. India had arguably been a far more meritocratic society before the British Raj settled down to enshrine the Brahmins in such a position of dominance. 19th-century ideas of race also got into the mix. The American scholar Thomas Metcalfe has shown how race ideology in that era defined European civilization as being at the peak of human attainment, while the darker-skinned races were portrayed as being primitive, weak, and dependent on European tutelage in order to develop. Indians internalized many of these prejudices, instilled in them by 2 centuries of the white man's dominance and the drumming into them of the cult of British superiority. I recall reading, as a child, the account of an early Indian visitor to England, astonished that even the shoeshine boys there were British. So completely had the mystique of English lordliness been internalized in India. The young prince, and later cricket star, Ranji, arriving in England as a student, was taken aback by the sight of Britishers engaging in low-caste work. He was assured the stevedores were only Irishmen. How the census undermined consensus. British cartography defined spaces the better to rule them. The map became an instrument of colonial control. Even the valuable British legacy, the museum, was devised in furtherance of the imperial project because here objects, artifacts, and symbols could be appropriated, named, labeled, arranged, ordered, classified, and thus controlled, exactly as the people could be. The census joined the map and the museum as tools of British imperial dominance in the 19th century. The British fondness for taxonomy and social classification continued to be in evidence throughout their rule, and was formalized by means of the census they undertook first in 1852 and then every 10 years from 1881, converting it into an ethnographic census in 1901. The census reconfirmed the process of defining castes, allocating them certain attributes, and inventing extraordinary labels for entire communities, such as martial races and criminal tribes. Just as a Brahmin became a sought-after designation enshrining social standing, the census definition of an individual's caste tended to seal the fate of any Shudra by fixing his identity across the entire country. Whereas prior to British rule, the Shudra had only to leave his village and try his fortunes in a different princely state in India where his caste would not have followed him. Colonialism made him a Shudra for life, wherever he was. The British belief in the fighting qualities of the Martial races also restricted the career possibilities of those not so classified, since British Army recruitment policies were usually based on caste classifications. In the old days, any individual with the height and musculature required could make a livelihood as a warrior, whatever his caste background. In British India, this was far more difficult, if not impossible, since entire regiments were constructed on the basis of caste identities. Census taking in British India differed significantly from the conduct of the census in Britain, since, unlike in the home country, the census in India was led by British anthropologists seeking to anatomize Indian society, the better to control and govern it. As I have mentioned earlier, Indians in pre-colonial times lived in communities with overlapping cultural practices, minimal self-awareness, and non-existent consciousness of the details of their differences from other communities, except in the most general terms. This is underscored by the scholar Sudipta Kaviraj, who observes that pre-colonial communities had imprecise, fuzzy boundaries because some collective identities are not territorially based, and because part of this fuzziness of social mapping would arise because traditional communities, unlike modern ones, are not enumerated. The census, of course, changed that, as did the more stable territorial lines drawn by the colonists on their new, and very precise, maps. In the pre-colonial era, community boundaries were far more blurred, and as a result, these communities were not self-conscious in the way they became under colonial rule. In the absence of the focused and intense allegiances of the modern era, pre-colonial groups were less likely to be antagonistic to each other over perceived community or communal differences. They have become so only as a consequence of their definition by the British in mutually exclusive terms. The British could find no one to tell them authoritatively where or in what number any particular community was. The census commissioners discovered that boundary lines among Hindus, Sikhs, and Jains barely existed, and that several Hindu and Muslim groups in different parts of the country shared similar social and cultural practices with regard to marriage, festivals, food, and worship. This went against the colonial assumption that communities must be mutually exclusive and that a person had to belong to one community or another. The British then simply superimposed their assumptions on the Indian reality, classifying people by religion, caste, or tribe based on imprecise answers to the census commissioners' questions. The British approach inevitably suffered from the prejudices and limitations of the age. Thus, the ICS's Herbert Risley, Census Commissioner for the 1901 census and author of the compendious The People of India, took an anthropological and eugenicist approach, making physical measurements of Indian skulls and noses on the then fashionable assumption that such physical qualities reflected racial stereotypes. It was he who announced that 1901's would be an ethnographic census and led it personally. Backed up by extensive photographs of facial features and social practices, Risley's work helped the British use such classification both to affirm their own convictions about European biological superiority over Indians and to construct racial, social, and tribal differences between different segments of India's people, which served to reshape and substantiate the dominant paradigms of social knowledge. Indians questioned by Risley's team predictably asserted both their caste identities and their entitlement to special privileges over other castes, accentuating the very differences the British wanted to see and had brought to the fore. By so doing, they sought benefits for their group, admission to certain military regiments, for instance, or scholarships to some educational institutions, at the expense of, or equal to, others. Such caste competition had been largely unknown in pre-British days. Caste consciousness had never been made so explicit as in the late 19th century. All these classifications, in turn, served the interests of the colonizers by providing them with a tool to create perceptions of difference between groups, to prevent unity amongst them and justifying British overlordship, which alone could be seen as transcending these differences and guiding the Indians to a higher, more civilized, plane of being, under the benign tutelage of the well-meaning empire. The British made these divisions such an article of faith that even a writer seen as broadly sympathetic to Indians, E.M. Forster, has his Indian protagonist, Aziz, say in a passage to India, "Nothing embraces the whole of India, nothing, nothing." This colonial process of identity creation in British India occurred even in the formation of linguistic identities. Both David Washbrook and David Lelyveld believe that territorially defined linguistic populations came into being out of the British colonial project to categorize, count, and classify, in order to control Indian society. The very notion of linguistic identities, they suggest, emerged from the 19th century belief in language as the cementing bond of social relations and the implicit conviction that races, or nations, spoke a common language and lived within defined territorial locations. Incidentally, in their zeal for classification, the British even subsumed ancient, and not dishonorable, professions like devadesis, temple dancers, or baijis, court musicians, who in some respects served functions akin to the geishas of Japan, into a rough and ready category of prostitutes, thus casting them out for the first time from respectable society. A troubling side effect of this changed pattern of social dominance was political. Ideas of democracy were not extended to all strata of Indian society under British rule. An instructive indication of this has lain in the rise of the more numerous, backward classes to positions of political prominence in independent India, which only became possible as democracy permitted free Indians to undo some of the more pernicious rigidities of the British buttressed Indian social order. The result of these British policies, whether by accident or design, or both, was a process of social separation that soon manifested itself as psychological separation and conscious of difference, leading in turn, where possible, to physical separation and, when demands for self-governance arose in time, political fragmentation, as each community was encouraged to fear that its self-interest could be jeopardized by the success of others. The Hindu-Muslim divide. The most important of these identity differences was the religious cleavage, real or imagined, but immediately focused upon, between Hindus and Muslims. Religion became a useful means of divide and rule. The Hindu-Muslim divide was, as the American scholar of religion Peter Gottschalk documents, defined, highlighted, and fomented by the British as a deliberate strategy. Three arguments, as the eminent historian Ramala Thapar has explained, were foundational to the colonial interpretation of Indian history. The first was the British division of Indian history into periods, labeled in accordance with the religion of the rulers, thus the Hindu, Muslim, and British periods formulated by James Mill in the History of British India, published between 1815 and 1826. Implicit in such periodization was the assumption that India was always composed of monolithic and mutually hostile religious communities, primarily Hindu and Muslim. Another foundational argument was that India's pre-colonial political economy was a form of Oriental despotism, which essentially held that Indian society was a static society ruled by despotic and oppressive rulers who impoverished the people. This is a notion I touch upon and have dismissed earlier in this book. The third foundational argument, that Hindu society had always been divided into four main castes or varnas, is addressed separately in this chapter. By the mid-19th century, the trio of Mill, Macaulay, and Friedrich Max Müller, the German Indologist working in Britain, had effectively established a colonial construction of the Indian past, which even Indians were taught to internalize. In their reading, Indian civilization was seen as essentially Hindu, as defined by the upper castes, and descended from the Aryan race, which it was claimed invaded around 1300 BCE from the Central Asian steppes in the north, displaced, and merged with indigenous populations, evolved a settled agrarian civilization, spoke Sanskrit, and composed the Vedas. The Muslims came as a first wave of invaders and conquerors, in turn supplanted by the British. This history in turn became the received wisdom for late 19th century Indian nationalists, Hindu and Muslim revivalists, and even cosmopolitan movements rooted in ancient Indian spiritualism like the Theosophical Society, whose co-founder, Colonel H. S. Alcott, became a major propagator of the Aryan origins theory in the 19th century. Alcott was the first, though, to argue that the Aryans were indigenous to India and took civilization from India to the West, an idea that is today promoted by Hindutva ideologues. By excluding Muslims from the essential national narrative, the 19th century colonial interpretation of Indian history helped give birth, in the 20th, to the two-nation theory that eventually divided the country. It also legitimized, with a veneer of scholarship, the British strategic policy of divide and rule, in which every effort was made by the imperialists to highlight differences between Hindus and Muslims to persuade the latter that their interests were incompatible with the advancement of the former. Once again, as with caste and linguistic differences, this had no basis in pre-colonial history. The scholar Gyanendra Pandey suggests that religious communalism was in large part a colonial construction. His work demonstrates how the colonialists' efforts to catalogue, classify, and categorize the Indians they ruled directly led to a heightened, horizontal caste consciousness and also contributed to the consciousness of religious difference between Hindus and Muslims. The colonial authorities often asked representatives of the two communities to self-consciously construct an established custom, such as by asking them what the prevailing beliefs and practices were around cow slaughter, which prompted both groups to give an exaggeratedly rigid version of what they believed the beliefs and practices should be. Though Pandey confirms that such identities existed in the pre-colonial period, he believes colonial policies led to the hardening of these communal identities. This is entirely plausible. Stories abound of the two communities habitually working together in pre-colonial times on issues that benefited principally one. For instance, Hindus helping Muslims to rebuild a shrine, or Muslims doing the same when a Hindu temple had to be reconstructed. Devout Hindus were sometimes given Muslim names and were often fluent scholars in Persian. Muslims served in the army of the Maratha, Hindu, warrior King Shivaji, as did Hindu Rajputs in the forces of the fiercely proud Muslim Emperor Aurangzeb. The Vijayanagara army included Muslim horseback contingents. At the village level, many historians argue that Hindus and Muslims shared a wide spectrum of customs and beliefs, at times even jointly worshipping the same saint or holy spot. In Kerala's famous pilgrimage site of Sabarimala, after an arduous climb to the hilltop shrine of Lord Ayyappa, the devotee first encounters a shrine to his Muslim disciple, Vavar Swami. In keeping with Muslim practice, there is no idol therein, merely a symbolic stone slab, a sword, Vavar was a warrior, and a green cloth, the color of Islam. Muslim divines manage the shrine. In another astonishing example, astonishing since it is both anachronistic and syncretistic, a temple in South Arcot, Tamil Nadu, hosts a deity of Muttal Ravuttan, a Muslim chieftain, complete with beard, kumkum, and toddy pot, who protects Draupadi in the Mahabharata. Note, of course, that Islam did not exist when the Mahabharata was composed, but in post-Islamic retellings, a Muslim chieftain has entered the plot. Indians of all religious communities had long lived intertwined lives, and even religious practices were rarely exclusionary. Thus, Muslim musicians played and sang Hindu devotional songs, Hindus thronged Sufi shrines and worshipped Muslim saints there, and Muslim artisans in Benares made the traditional masks for the Hindu Ram Leela performances. Northern India celebrated what was called a Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb, a syncretic culture that melded the cultural practices of both faiths. Ramala Thapar has recounted how deeply devotional poetry was written by some poets who were born Muslim but worshipped Hindu deities, notably Sayyid Ibrahim, popularly known as Raskhan, whose dohas and bhajans dedicated to Lord Krishna were widely recited in the 16th century. The Mughal court, she points out, became the most impressive patron of the translation of many Sanskrit religious texts into Persian, including the epic Mahabharata, translated as the Raznama, and the Bhagavad Gita, with Brahmin priests collaborating on the translations with Persian scholars. To Gyanendra Pandey, such tales, as well as parables of Hindu generals in Mughal courts or of Hindu and Muslim ministers in the Sikh ruler Ranjit Singh's entourage, suggest there was a fuzziness about self-conscious identities and a lack of self-definition on the basis of religion, or even of caste, within both the Hindu and Muslim populations. These stories do not suggest mutually incompatible or hostile ideologies. Acceptance of difference, as Swami Vivekananda famously declared at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago, was central to the Indian experience throughout its long civilizational history. Nor was religion in the past necessarily the overall basis for collective action, let alone political mobilization. Caste, community, jati, and biradari played their parts. But by encroaching on the terrain of the various communities, thereby invalidating indigenous social relations, the colonial state loosened the bonds that had held them together for generations across these divides. The facts are clear: large-scale conflicts between Hindus and Muslims, religiously defined, only began under colonial rule. Many other kinds of social strife were labeled as religious due to the colonists' Orientalist assumption that religion was the fundamental division in Indian society. There is a general consensus that it is questionable whether a totalizing Hindu or Muslim identity existed in any meaningful sense in India prior to the 19th century. I realize this assertion will rouse the skeptics, who will argue that Muslims and Hindus were slaughtering each other since at least 512 CE, when the teenaged Arab warrior Muhammad bin Qasim conquered the Hindu kingdom of Sindh. Indeed, the argument that tensions existed for 1,200 years, since the advent of Islam in North India, is often made both by Pakistanis, to justify separation, and by acolytes of the Hindutva, Hindu nationalist, cause, who routinely assert that as many as 60,000 Hindu temples were razed to the ground by Muslim rulers over the centuries, and mosques built on 3,000 of those temples' foundations. That some of this happened is indisputable. One only has to visit Sultan Iltutmish's celebrated mosque and its surrounding architecture at the Qutb complex in Delhi, to see the elaborate Hindu religious carvings that still adorn the pillars. But the research carried out separately by historians Cynthia Talbot and Richard M. Eaton in two different parts of India suggests that temple desecration was largely a phenomenon of the advancing frontier, occasioned by warfare and occurring mainly in the intense frenzy of armed conflict across changing territorial lines. Eaton believes that temple destruction by Turkic and other Muslim rulers throughout India occurred mainly in kingdoms in the process of being conquered. A royal temple symbolized the king's power in Hindu political thought, and so destroying it signified that king's utter humiliation. Talbot's research in Andhra Pradesh at the time of Muslim expansion into the region confirms similar findings. In other words, invaders' attacks on temples were politically, rather than religiously, motivated. The portrayal of Muslims as Islamist idol-breakers, driven to destroy temples because of religious fanaticism, argue both Eaton and Talbot, is far from the truth. Obviously, raiders who came and went like Mahmud of Ghazni, Muhammad Ghori, and Nadir Shah were bent on destruction and pillage, but the Muslims who stayed in India attacked temples not to destroy them, but because they valued them and understood their importance. Such an argument is bound to prove contentious, especially given numerous examples of iconoclasm on the part of Muslim warriors. But there are far more numerous examples of harmony and coexistence. The best example of Indian religious coexistence in the pre-colonial era, of identities being so creatively held that they could accommodate easily to each other, comes from today's state of Kerala, dubbed by the British the Malabar Coast. The openness to the external influences, Arab, Roman, Chinese, British, Islamic, Christian, Brahminical, that went into the making of the Malayali, Keralite, people reflected their trading heritage. More than 2 millennia ago, Keralites had trade relations not just with other parts of India but with the Arab world, the Phoenicians, and the Roman Empire, so Malayalis have had, for a long time now, an open and welcoming attitude to the rest of humanity. Jews fleeing Roman persecution found refuge here. There is evidence of their settlement in Cranganore as far back as 68 CE. And 1,300 years later, the Jews settled in Kochi, where they built a magnificent synagogue that still stands. Kerala's Christians belong to the oldest Christian community in the world outside Palestine. And when St. Thomas, one of Jesus's 12 apostles, brought Christianity to Kerala, it is said he was welcomed on shore by a flute-playing Jewish girl. St. Thomas made converts among the high-born elite, the Nambudiri Brahmins, which meant there were Indians whose families had practiced Christianity for far longer than the ancestors of any Briton could lay claim to. Islam came to Kerala not by the sword, as it did in northern India, but through traders, travelers, and missionaries, who brought its message of equality and brotherhood to the coastal people. The new faith was peacefully embraced and encouraged, rather than rejected. Indeed, as I have mentioned earlier, the Zammarin of Calicut was so impressed by the seafaring skills of this community that he issued a decree in the 16th century, obliging each fisherman's family in his kingdom to bring up one son as a Muslim to man his all-Muslim navy, commanded by sailors of Arab descent, the Kunjali Marayakars. The first recorded instance in Kerala of violence involving the Muslim community, religiously defined as opposed to the clashing armies of contending warriors or kings, was in British India, when the Mapla Rebellion occurred in 1920. Looking at peninsular South India at the time of the Muslim invasions, from the 14th to the 17th centuries, Cynthia Talbot observed that since a majority of medieval South India's population continued to be non-Muslim, even within the regions where Muslims were politically dominant, the two societies always overlapped. A certain degree of cooperation and collaboration was inevitable in these circumstances. The Muslim polities of the peninsula were dependent on Hindu officials and warriors for tax collection and maintenance of order in the countryside. As to the rhetorical portrayal of each other, both denigrating and tolerant representations of the other coexisted at any given phase, but they tended to highlight foreignness rather than religion. And foreignness, of course, was an attribute that tended to fade, if not entirely disappear, with time. The political consequences of this British denial of the pre-colonial past and the deliberate imperial construction of a Hindu-Muslim divide after 1835 became vividly apparent in the late 19th century. When Alan Octavian Hume founded the Indian National Congress, he actively welcomed Indians of all faiths to the organization. Its first few presidents included Hindus, Christians, Parsis, and Muslims. The British did not approve of Hume's liberal attitude. Had they been sincere about empowering a cooperative class of English-educated Indians, they could easily have done so, co-opting these liberal lawyers, as they mostly were, into the British governance of India. Instead, the British watched the rise to prominence of Congress, a secular body transcending religion, with growing disapproval, and pronounced it a Hindu-dominated organization. They instigated a Muslim nobleman, Nawab Khwaja Salimullah of Dhaka, to start a rival organization in 1906 for his co-religionists alone, the Muslim League. Meanwhile, Lord Curzon's decision in 1903 to partition Bengal, ostensibly for administrative reasons but in reality to create a Muslim-majority province in the east, aroused fierce opposition from all segments of Bengali society and from Indian nationalists everywhere, who saw it as a transparent attempt to divide the country. The British deliberately sold the partition of Bengal to the Muslims as promoting their interests, so that the Nawab of Dhaka, who had initially condemned the division of his province as beastly, was persuaded to change his mind under the influence of Lord Curzon's visit to him. This followed speeches in which the Viceroy promised that the partition would invest the Mohammedans of eastern Bengal with a unity which they had not enjoyed since the days of the old Mussulman viceroys and kings. To sweeten the pill further, the British government advanced the Nawab a private loan of £100,000, at a concessional rate of interest, and soon the Nawab and his followers did a U-turn to become staunch supporters of the partition of Bengal. The British made no effort to hide their partiality. Herbert Risley, the architect of the scheme, admitted frankly that, "One of our main objects is to split up and thereby weaken a solid body of opponents to our rule." The Lieutenant Governor of Bengal, Sir Bampfylde Fuller, said publicly, he later claimed that he had done so in jest, that of his two wives, meaning the Muslim and Hindu sections of his province, the Mohammedan was the favorite. His jest was taken rather too seriously by some Muslim elements, who concluded that by these words the British authorities were ready to grant them impunity for anti-Hindu violence, which then proceeded to spread in East Bengal. Assaults, rape, and abductions against the Hindu minority followed. Thus, reported Henry Nevin's son, a new religious feud was established in eastern Bengal. Administrative division, as the protesters saw clearly, served as an assault upon the social unity of Bengali communities. Nevin's son goes on, "I have almost invariably found English officers and officials on the side of the Mohammedans where there is any rivalry of race or religion at all. And in eastern Bengal this national inclination is now encouraged by the government's open resolve to retain the Mohammedan support of the partition by any means in its power. It was against the Hindus only that all the petty persecution of officialdom was directed. It was they who were excluded from government posts, it was Hindu schools from which government patronage was withdrawn. When Mohammedans rioted, the punitive police ransacked Hindu houses, and companies of little Gurkhas were quartered on Hindu populations. It was the Hindus who in one place were forbidden to sit on the riverbank. Of course, the plea was that only the Hindus were opposed to the government's policy of dividing them from the rest of their race, so that they alone needed suppression. Yet the Congress initially chose to take this development in its stride, Seeing the League as representing merely the landed aristocracy and upper-class merchants and landlords among the Muslim population, it deemed it not to be a threat. Indeed, the election of the moderate Aga Khan as its first president seemed to confirm this judgment. The Congress declared membership of the League not to be incompatible with membership of the Congress, continued to invite League members to Congress meetings, and on 3 remarkable occasions, elected Muslim League members to preside over the Congress. Hakim Ajmal Khan, Maulana Muhammad Ali, and Dr. M.A. Ansari enjoy the remarkable distinction of having been presidents of both the Congress and the League without having to give up either. In 1916, Motilal Nehru was chosen by the Congress to draft, together with a brilliant young Muslim lawyer called Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the principles that would govern cooperation with the Muslim League. Their work, recognizing the principle that decisions would not be taken affecting the interests and beliefs of a minority community, without the agreement of a majority of that community's representatives, formed the foundation of what was widely hailed as the Lucknow Pact. The Congress's leading literary light, the poetess Sarojini Naidu, hailed Jinnah as the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity, and set about editing a compilation of his speeches and writings. Indeed, for all the British encouragement, the Muslims of India as a whole did not think of their futures as anything but entwined with their Hindu compatriots. It is striking that, as late as 1918, in his most substantial book on the Indian question, the Aga Khan articulated a vision of India as a confluence of 4 civilizations: Western, Far Eastern, Brahmanical, and Mohammedan, and expressed an Indian patriotism that assumed close understanding between Hindus and Muslims, including a common desire for India, rather than Britain, to colonize East Africa. Similarly, he is dismissive of political pan-Islamism, speaking of Islam as a social, cultural, and spiritual force that unites believers morally around the world, but stressing that religion has more and more become a spiritual force in the modern world, and less a temporal one. In this era, national and material interests have predominated over religious ties. These were views widely held by other educated Indian Muslims and had been expressed in almost identical terms by Justice Syed Mahmood 4 decades previously. Mahatma Gandhi, upon assuming the leadership of the Congress, also sought to make common cause with Muslim opinion by spearheading a caliphate agitation in support of Indian Muslim demands to restore the caliphate in Turkey after the collapse during World War I of the Ottoman Empire. That movement fizzled out when it was overtaken by domestic developments, including some assaults by caliphate enthusiasts on Hindus deemed insufficiently supportive of the cause, and was, in any case, made irrelevant by events in Turkey. But it was an earnest display of the Congress's determined effort to represent all Indians, irrespective of faith, and not to surrender to the British project of religious division. The British conducted censuses had overt political significance, since the census numbers were crucial to the political debates at the beginning of the 20th century. They were ignored in constituting the British Indian Army, in which Muslims accounted for 30% of the Indians serving in uniform despite being only 20% of the population. The Dalit leader Dr. B.R. Ambedkar suggested this disproportionate representation in the army was deliberately designed to counteract the forces of Hindu agitation against the British Raj. But when it came to politics, the census figures proved most useful to the British in heightening a sense among some Muslims of being an endangered minority. Communal identity and representation became major issues, by design, when separate electorates were being defined based on religious identity for the first time by the Minto-Morley reforms. Similarly, as we have seen, Census numbers engendered a huge upheaval in colonial governance when the British sought to partition the province of Bengal. In exactly the same way, when a limited franchise was finally extended to ordinary Indians by the Montagu, Chelmsford reforms to vote for positions of limited authority in British-approved bodies, imperial officials provided a political franchise to several of the communal identities the British government had created within Indian society, each one competing against the other to gain favor with the colonialists. Thus there were seats reserved for Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and so on. This resulted in the aggravation of communal identities, since what little politics was permitted could quickly devolve into a communal competition for limited resources. Public sentiments could be aroused to exaggerate differences amongst Indians, which redounded to the benefit of the British, who, of course, were above it all. So Englishmen who would have shuddered at the idea of allowing the Jews of Golders Green to vote separately in London elections, enthusiastically arranged separate electorates for the Muslims of India, where Muslim voters could only vote for Muslim candidates, Sikhs for Sikhs, and Christians for Christians. The practice prompted Will Durant to observe that the British approach intensifies and encourages the racial and religious divisions which statesmanship would seek to heal. But healing was not the object of government policy. As we have seen from the outset of this chapter, a divided people were easier to subjugate. Lord Olivier, Secretary of State for India in the 1920s, openly admitted to a predominant bias in British officialdom in favor of the Muslim community, largely as a make-weight against Hindu nationalism. This was compounded by the British tendency to give the Muslims even more than they had asked for. Thus, when the Muslim League demanded one of two possible privileges in the 5 Muslim-majority provinces, either statutory majorities, enshrined in law, with joint electorates, or separate electorates for Muslims, the British gave them statutory majorities with separate electorates in their communal award, letting the Muslim Leaguers have it both ways. Ironically, had Indian politics been encouraged to develop as British politics had, along ideological lines, one could have seen the emergence of a conservative party and a socialist one, with some liberals in between. These tendencies were all present among Indian public men. This kind of conventional political contention could have kept India united, with Jinnah and Nehru becoming the Disraeli and Gladstone of their era in an emerging Indian dominion. But colonial policies drove conservatives and socialists alike to define themselves primarily in relation to the communal question, leading ultimately to the tragic sundering of the country. The alterations this brought about to Indian sensibilities were profound. Most scholars of Indian history blamed the British for the gradual whittling away of the shared syncretic traditions described earlier, as Alex von Tunzelmann noted in her History, Indian Summer, The Secret History of the End of an Empire, when the British started to define communities based on religious identity and attach political representation to them. Many Indians stopped accepting the diversity of their own thoughts and began to ask themselves in which of the boxes they belonged. Such divisions were heightened not just between religious communities but also within them. Thus, the British can be largely blamed for the creation of previously non-existent Shia-Sunni tensions within the Muslim population of Lucknow. Prior to the British annexation of Oudh, the two sects had lived in harmony under a Shia Nawab, whose celebrations of the Shia festival of Muharram had included Sunnis and Hindus as well in a public affirmation of his people's fraternity. Once the British had deposed the Nawab in 1836, the unifying symbol of the throne was lost, and the relationship between the ruling Shia nobility and the non-Shia subjects of the kingdom, Sunnis and Hindus, irrevocably transformed. The exaggeration by the British of communal identities now embraced sectarian differences between the two Muslim sects. As the scholar Keith George recounts, by 1903, religious rhetoric between Shias and Sunnis had reached such heights that Sunnis in Lucknow did not join in the Marsiya elegies during Muharram, but instead recited a praise of the first three caliphs called the Madha Sahaba. Shias responded with Tabara curses upon the Sahaba. Shia leaders also managed to persuade the British government that Sunni practices during Muharram were largely irrelevant, so the British enacted strict laws against practices by Sunnis that could be offensive to Shias. Before long, the British had decided to authorize separate Shia and Sunni processions to commemorate Muharram. The British-sponsored Shia-Sunni divide in Lucknow is one of the clearest examples of how the British encouraged differences, and how Indians sought to create communities that the Raj would recognize and to which it would give political weight. This occurred, as it happened, at the very time when various political groups were competing for space in the expanded Indian representation announced for the viceroys and governors' councils under the Minto Morley reforms. When the British authorities assumed responsibility for banning or approving commemorations, arbitrating disputes, and regulating procession routes, George has explained, they transformed religious differences into public, political, and legal issues. And so they have remained. Far from promoting Indian political unity, British policies identified, accentuated, and legitimized such divisions. One can lay not only a Hindu-Muslim divide at their door but also credit them for giving legal definition to a new political division between the Sunni and Shia communities. The British promoted cleavage also divided the Muslim community. A prominent Deobandi cleric who opposed the communal polarization promoted by the British and fought against the League's Pakistan project, Maulana Hussain Ahmad Madani, wrote passionately to a co-religionist as late as 1943. Muslims have been together with the Hindus since they moved to Hindustan. And I have been with them since I was born. I was born and raised here. If two people live together in the same country, the same city, they will share a lot of things with each other. Till the time there are Muslims in India, they will be together with the Hindus. In the bazaars, in homes, in railways, in trams, buses, lorries, in stations, colleges, post offices, jails, police stations, courts, councils, assemblies, hotels, etc. You tell me where and when we don't meet them or are not together with them. You are a zamindar. Are not your tenants Hindus? You are a trader, you don't buy and sell from Hindus? You are a lawyer, don't you have Hindu clients? You are in a district or municipal board, won't you be dealing with Hindus? Who is not with the Hindus? The creation and perpetuation of Hindu-Muslim antagonism was the most significant accomplishment of British imperial policy. The project of divide et impera would reach its culmination in the horrors of partition that eventually accompanied the collapse of British authority in 1945. A saint among sinners, the great Indian opponent of the British Raj, Mahatma Gandhi, opposed colonial rule in an unusual way, not by violence but by the strength of moral force. Gandhi's life was, of course, his lesson. He was unique among the statesmen of the 20th century in his determination not only to live his beliefs but also to reject any separation between beliefs and action. Gandhi was a philosopher who was constantly seeking to live out his own ideas, whether they applied to individual self-improvement or social change. His autobiography was typically subtitled "The Story of My Experiments with Truth." Truth could not be obtained by untruthful or unjust means, which included inflicting violence upon one's opponent. The means had to be worthy of the ends. If they were not, the ends would fail too. To describe his method, Gandhi coined the expression satyagraha, literally, holding on to truth, or, as he variously described it, truth force, love force, or soul force. He disliked the English term, passive resistance, because satyagraha required activism, not passivity. If you believed in truth and cared enough to obtain it, Gandhi felt, you could not afford to be passive. You had to be prepared actively to suffer for truth. So non-violence, like many later concepts labeled with a negation, from non-cooperation to non-alignment, meant much more than the denial of an opposite. It did not merely imply the absence of violence. Non-violence was the way to vindicate the truth, not by the infliction of suffering on the opponent but on oneself. It was essential to willingly accept punishment in order to demonstrate the strength of one's convictions. This was the approach Gandhi brought to the movement for India's independence, and it worked. Where sporadic terrorism and moderate constitutionalism had both proved ineffective, Gandhi took the issue of freedom to the masses as one of simple right and wrong and gave them a technique to which the British had no response. By going beyond the councils and the meeting rooms, he seized the public imagination. By abstaining from violence, the Mahatma wrested the moral advantage. By breaking the law non-violently, he showed up the injustice of the law. By accepting the punishments imposed on him, he confronted his captors with their own brutalization. By voluntarily imposing suffering upon himself in his hunger strikes, he demonstrated the lengths to which he was prepared to go in defense of what he considered to be right. In the end, he made the perpetuation of British rule an impossibility. In this, Gandhi was embodying what the doughty nationalist Lala Lajpat Rai had propounded in 1903. The British are not a spiritual people, the Lala had said. They are either a fighting race or a commercial nation. It would be throwing pearls before swine to appeal to them in the name of the higher morality or justice or on ethical grounds. They are a self-reliant, haughty people, who can appreciate self-respect and self-reliance even in their opponents. Despite this insight, Lajpat Rai was himself killed, aged 63, by repeated blows to the head by the stave of a superintendent of police, James A. Scott, while leading a peaceful, non-violent protest against the British in 1928. As the non-violent Indian nationalist movement gained traction, public sympathy, and international attention in the 1920s and 1930s, with Gandhi seizing the world's imagination through his satyagraha, his fasts, and the empire-defying Salt March, the British felt obliged to grant improved measures of self-governance through the Government of India Act, 1935. Even then, however, the franchise was extended to less than 10% of the population, and, as before, Indians voted not as citizens of a single country but as members of different religious groups, with Muslim voters choosing Muslim members from a reserved list, a further confirmation of divide et impera. Separate electorates were part of the British attempt to thwart Mahatma Gandhi's mass politics, which for the first time had created a common national consciousness not just among the educated elite who had formerly dominated the Congress but among the general public he had successfully mobilized. The British decision to declare the community then known as the Untouchables, today as Dalits, or more bureaucratically as scheduled castes, to be a minority community entitled to separate representation, distinct from other Hindus, in a new category called the depressed classes, was seen by Indian nationalists as a ploy to divide the majority community in furtherance of imperial interests. Dalits, in turn, saw the nationalist movement as dominated by the same upper castes that had long discriminated against them, and Dalit leaders like Ambedkar, a brilliant constitutional scholar who had risen from hardscrabble poverty by sheer dint of merit, embraced separate electorates as a means of asserting their right to choose their own representatives. The Indian National Congress, led by Mahatma Gandhi, was already opposed to separate electorates for Muslims, Sikhs, and Christians, since it saw the practice as designed to promote a sense that they were separate communities whose interests were somehow different from the general mass of Indians. Still, the Congress could not formally oppose separate electorates for fear of antagonizing minority groups, while the British were busy stoking minority fears of Hindu domination if and whenever self-government came to India. The Congress, therefore, confined its opposition to the principle that separate electorates were wrong and unnecessary but could only be abandoned with the consent of the minorities. However, the British attempt to separate the depressed classes was of a different order, since it was the first time that separate electorates were being proposed within a religious community, and the strategy of fragmenting Indian nationalism and breaking the incipient unity of the Indian masses was clearly apparent to Congress leaders. Gandhi demanded that the representatives of the depressed classes should be elected by the general electorate under a wide, and if possible universal, common franchise, and undertook a fast unto death in 1932 that riveted the nation and compelled the British and the Dalit leadership to give in. Under a political compromise, known as the Pune Pact, that year separate electorates for the depressed classes were abandoned, but additional seats were reserved for them in the provincial and central legislatures, an increase from 51 to 145 in the former and to 18% of the central legislature. Interestingly enough, the leader of the Dalits who clashed with Gandhi over the issue, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, went on to serve after independence as chairman of the drafting committee for India's constitution and ensured that his country would have the world's first and farthest-reaching affirmative action program for his community. Though separate electorates were dropped for good, 84 seats in independent India's 543-seat lower house were reserved for scheduled castes and tribes, as were a quota of places in government service and universities, guaranteeing not just opportunities but assured outcomes. If the Dalits did not end up with separate electorates, the Muslim League found it difficult initially to profit from them. The ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity was not an appellation destined to endure for Jinnah. Disdaining the populism and the mass appeal of Gandhi, Jinnah had retreated to his law practice in England, only to return, after a long political sulk, as the leader determined to take the Muslim League towards separatism. Jinnah began to claim that India's Muslims represented a nation unto themselves. "We are different beings," he declared in barefaced denial of his entire upbringing, career, social relations, and personal life. "There is nothing in life which links us together. Our names, our clothes, our foods, they are all different, our economic life, our educational idea, our treatment of women, our attitude to animals. We challenge each other at every point of the compass." For the Savile Row suit-wearing, sausage-eating, whiskey-swilling Jinnah to go on about clothes and food was a bit rich, as was the reference to women's habits coming from the lips of a man who had been famously indulgent of his young wife's scandalously bold attire. But the political choice had been made to accentuate difference, and that is what the Muslim League leader set out to do. He sought to establish the League as the sole representatives of India's Muslims, but Muslim voters, inconveniently enough, demurred, voting for Muslims of other political allegiances, including, most gallingly, for Muslim members of the Indian National Congress, as well as for the League. The 1935 elections saw the Indian National Congress being elected to rule 8 provinces. The party won an astonishing 615 of the 539 general seats it contested, and even 23 of the 39 seats, reserved exclusively for Muslims, that the Congress contested. Several other parties, and 383 independents, also won seats. Trailing a distant second to the Congress was the Muslim League, which failed to win even a plurality of the seats reserved for Muslims, winning just 106 of the 1,383 seats at stake and failing to take control of any province. The domestic political contest, it seemed, had been decisively settled in favor of the inclusive, pluralist, multi-ethnic party, the Congress. But those who saw it that way had spoken too soon. The Congress's victory was far from determinant. Though the elections involved some 13.3 million voters and marked a significant step forward in the creation of representative governance, most key powers were still retained by the viceroy, and no elections were held to the central government, which continued to be run by him. This was deliberate. Alarmed by the growing popularity of the Congress, the British counted upon what the Viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, called the potency of provincial autonomy to destroy the effectiveness of the Congress as an all-India instrument of revolution. The hope was to give the party's provincial leaders enough of a taste of the loaves and fishes of office, to wean them away from their national leadership and give them a personal stake in collaboration with the Raj. The electoral system was also stacked in favor of rural representation in order to get more landlords elected whose interests would diverge from the socialist programs of the Congress's national leaders. So much of the talk of self-government was hollow, and its hollowness was confirmed when it was the Viceroy, and not the elected representatives of the Indian people, who declared war on Germany on behalf of India in 1939. This promptly precipitated the resignation of the elected Congress ministries, in protest at not being consulted on such a vital matter. The pretense of developing responsible political institutions in India was laid to rest. And soon a rough beast, in Yeats' immortal words, arose amid the Muslims of India, slouching towards a new Bethlehem to be born. Stumbling towards Armageddon. To the surprise of both their supporters and their critics, the Congress ministries in the 9 provinces had conducted themselves as able stewards of the governmental system of the British Raj. For the most part, they did little to dismantle oppressive British laws, and in some cases proved as zealous in arresting radicals as the British themselves had been. Meanwhile, both during his party's electoral setback and then when the Congress opened the window of opportunity by resigning its ministries, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the increasingly hardline leader of the Muslim League, had proven to be a skilled tactician, making up for the League's defeat in the Muslim-majority provinces of Punjab and Bengal, by in effect co-opting the victorious leaders there, Sir Sikandar Hayat Khan of the Unionist Party and Fazlul Huq of the Krishak Praja Party, respectively, onto the League platform. The Congress itself was riven by infighting. Its acceptance of office had both alienated its left wing and made it vulnerable to largely specious charges of imposing Hindu majority rule on the Muslim minority. Ironically, when war came, the Viceroy would have found ready support from the Congress, whose leader, Jawaharlal Nehru, had declared that in any conflict between democracy and fascism, our sympathies must inevitably be on the side of democracy. I should like India to play its full part and throw all her resources into the struggle for a new order. Nehru's abhorrence of fascism was so great that he would gladly have led a free India into war on the side of the democracies, provided that choice was made by Indians and not imposed upon them by the British. But when Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939 led Britain to declare war upon it, Indians noted the irony of the English fighting to defend the sovereignty of a weak country resisting the brute force of foreign conquest, precisely what Indian nationalists were doing against British imperialism. So Britain would fight Germany for doing to Poland what Britain had been doing to India for nearly 200 years. Nehru blamed British appeasement for the fall of Spain to the fascists, the betrayal of Ethiopia to the Italians, and the selling out of Czechoslovakia to the Nazis. He wanted India to have no part of the responsibility for British policy, which he saw as designed to protect the narrow class interests of a few imperialists. Despite his stated antipathy for fascism and the Nazis, Nehru saw no reason why Indians should be expected to make sacrifices to preserve British rule over them. How could a subject India be ordered to fight for a free Poland? A free and democratic India, on the other hand, would gladly fight for freedom and democracy. Under his direction, the Congress Working Committee adopted a resolution making this case, while rejecting former President Subhas Chandra Bose's demand that civil disobedience be launched immediately. Nehru made no secret of his own anti-Nazi views. All he wanted was some indication from the British government of respect for his position so that India and Britain could then gladly join in a struggle for freedom. The Congress leaders made it clear to the Viceroy that all they needed was a declaration that India would be given the chance to determine its own future after the war. The Congress position was greeted with understanding and even some approval in left-wing circles in Britain, but though he would have found allies in the anti-fascist Congress governments in the provinces, and amongst Congress legislators in the Central Assembly, Lord Linlithgow did not so much as make a pretense of consulting India's elected leaders before declaring war on Germany, on behalf of India. Instead, he turned to the Muslim League for support. The Congress had, in fact, hoped for a joint approach on the war issue with the League. The Viceroy's statement in October 1939 emphatically rejecting the Congress position, however, prompted the Working Committee, with Nehru in the lead, to order all its provincial ministries to resign rather than continue to serve a war effort, in which they had been denied an honorable role. The decision was taken on a point of principle, but politically it proved a monumental blunder. It deprived the Congress of their only leverage with the British government, cast aside the fruits of their electoral success, and presented Jinnah with a golden opportunity. He broke off talks with the Congress, declaring the day of the Congress resignations a day of deliverance, and turned to the Viceroy instead. 2 years in the political wilderness after the electoral setbacks of 1935 had already transformed the League. Congress rule in many provinces had unwittingly increased Muslim concern, even alarm, about the implications of democratic majoritarian rule in a country so overwhelmingly Hindu. Many Muslims began to see themselves as a political and economic minority, and the League spoke to their insecurities. Jinnah had begun to come to the conclusion that the only effective answer to the Congress's political strength would be separation, the partition of the country to create an independent state in the Muslim-majority areas of the Northwest and East. This demand would be enshrined in the League's Lahore Resolution of March 23, 1940, calling for the creation of Pakistan. Nehru and his fellow Congress leaders were largely oblivious to the change of thinking amongst many League members, manifest in an increasingly populist political strategy. It was only in 1939, for instance, that Jinnah began to learn Urdu and to don the Muslim ochkan, a knee-length coat buttoned down the front, for official photographs, actions reminiscent of that old saw from the French tumult of 1848, "I am their leader, I must follow them." In October 1939, Jinnah persuaded Lord Linlithgow, the Viceroy, to enlist the League as an interlocutor equal to the Congress and as the sole representative of India's Muslims, a position to which its electoral results did not yet entitle it. The Viceroy, anxious to prevent Congress-League unity on the war issue, consented. The League's policy, he observed, was now the most important obstacle to any talk of Indian independence, and therefore needed to be encouraged. That November Jinnah was invited, for the first time, to broadcast a special message to Muslims on the occasion of the Eid festival, an explicit recognition of the League president as the spokesman of the Muslim community. Nehru and the Congress simply saw such claims as illegitimate and premised on bigotry. However, they did not do enough to address the real crisis of confidence brewing in the Muslim community at the prospect of majority rule. Through much of 1940 the Congress played a waiting game, hoping for British concessions. Some congressmen were prepared to go even farther and extend direct support to the war effort if there was a national government established in India to support it. But Linlithgow was a large, slow-moving and slow-witted man. His thinking was far removed from even the most basic of Indian aspirations. He wrote to London in April 1940, "I am not too keen to start talking about a period after which British rule will have ceased in India. I suspect that that day is very remote, and I feel the less we say about it in all probability the better." Indeed, that was the year in which Churchill confidently expressed the belief that the British Empire would last 1,000 years. When the official response of the government came in August 1940, it was a derisory offer to associate a few representative Indians with the Viceroy's toothless advisory councils. Nehru rejected this utterly. Civil disobedience seemed the only answer. The government decided not to wait for what Nehru might do. They arrested him on October 30, 1940 and, after a trial distinguished by a magnificent statement by the accused, "It is the British Empire itself that is on trial before the bar of the world," sentenced him to 4 years in prison. The conditions of his detention were unusually harsh, with a number of petty indignities inflicted upon him, in particular relating to his ability to send or receive mail, which deprived him of the solace that letters had provided over the years. In December 1941, however, despite the opposition of Winston Churchill, the War Cabinet in London authorized the release of all the imprisoned congressmen. Nehru hoped in vain for some policy declaration by the British that would enable him to commit India to the Allied cause, but the reactionary Churchill and his blinkered representatives in New Delhi went the other way, with Churchill, "I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion," explicitly declaring that the principles of the Atlantic Charter would not apply to India. This was all the more inexplicable in the face of the rout of British forces in Asia. Singapore fell in February, Burma in March, the Japanese were at India's gates in the east, and Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose, who had fled British India, had fashioned an Indian National Army, in mid-1941 out of prisoners of war, to fight alongside the Japanese. Nehru had no desire to see one emperor's rule supplanted by another's. He started organizing the Congress to prepare for resistance to the Japanese. American sympathy was matched by that of the Labour Party in the War Cabinet. Clement Attlee persuaded his colleagues to send the socialist Sir Stafford Cripps to India in early 1942, with an offer of dominion status after the war, with the possibility of partition. Cripps was already a legend in British politics, a former Solicitor General who had been expelled from the Labour Party in 1939 for advocating a united front with the Conservatives, which, of course, came to pass during the war, and who combined an ascetic vegetarianism with a flamboyant ego. "There, but for the grace of God, goes God," Churchill remarked of him. Cripps had visited India after the outbreak of war in 1939 and knew many Indian leaders. He considered Nehru a friend. Yet the Cripps mission was welcomed by Jinnah, but foundered on the opposition of the Congress. Mahatma Gandhi objected principally because the British proposal appeared to concede the idea of partition. He memorably called the offer a post-dated check, an imaginative journalist added, on a crashing bank, and urged its rejection. Congress President Maulana Azad insisted that the defense of India should be the responsibility of Indian representatives, not the unelected government of India led by the British Viceroy, and it was on this issue that Nehru refused to compromise. Cripps was inclined to give in, and spoke of an Indian national government running the country's defense with the Viceroy functioning as a figurehead, like the British king. But he had exceeded his instructions. Churchill, I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion, abetted by the hidebound Viceroy, Linlithgow, and the often hapless Commander-in-Chief, Lord Archibald Wavell, scuttled the negotiations. Churchill had strong views on Gandhi. Commenting on the Mahatma's meeting with the Viceroy of India, 1931, he had notoriously declared, "It is alarming and nauseating to see Mr. Gandhi, a seditious Middle Temple lawyer, now posing as a fakir of a type well known in the East, striding half-naked up the steps of the viceregal palace, while he is still organizing and conducting a campaign of civil disobedience, to parley on equal terms with the representative of the Emperor King." Gandhi had nothing in common with fakirs, Muslim spiritual mendicants, but Churchill was rarely accurate about India. Gandhiism and all it stands for, declared Churchill, will, sooner or later, have to be grappled with and finally crushed. In such matters Churchill was the most reactionary of Englishmen, with views so extreme they cannot be excused as being reflective of their times. In fact, Churchill's statements appalled most of his contemporaries. Even the positive gloss placed on him today seems inexcusable. He put himself at the head of a movement of irreconcilable imperialist romantics, wrote Boris Johnson in his recent admiring biography of Churchill. Die-hard defenders of the Raj and of the God-given right of every pink-jowled Englishman to sit on his veranda and glory in the possession of India. Mahatma Gandhi, increasingly exasperated by the British, argued that Nehru's pro-Allied position had won India no concessions. His public message to the government was to leave India to God or anarchy. Nehru, ever the Harrovian Anglophile, quoted Cromwell, in a conscious echo of the Harrovian Amory, who had used the same words just 2 years earlier in Parliament in calling for Neville Chamberlain's resignation as Prime Minister. "You have sat too long here for any good you have been doing. Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, go." On August 5, 1942, in Bombay, the All India Congress Committee, at Gandhi's urging, adopted a resolution moved by Nehru, and seconded by Patel, calling upon Britain to, in a journalistic paraphrase that became more famous than the actual words of the resolution, quit India. Gandhi's own preferred phrase was "do or die." Within 36 hours, the Congress leaders were arrested. For all of Gandhi's devotion to non-violence, his jailing, together with the rest of the Congress leadership, left the Quit India movement in the hands of the young and the hot-headed. An underground movement was born, which actively resorted to acts of sabotage. Ordinary people took improbable risks to hoist the national flag on government buildings. Young newspaper boys added sotto voce subversion to their sales cries, "Times of India. Quit India. Times of India. Quit India." In the weeks after the arrests, no day passed without reports of clashes between demonstrators and police. The British responded with ruthless repression, firing upon unarmed protesters, killing dozens every week, flogging offenders, and censoring and closing down nationalist newspapers. Quit India became the drumbeat of a national awakening, But all it did was prolong the nation's continued subjugation. Wartime hardened British attitudes to the prisoners as well. Gandhi should not be released on the account of a mere threat of fasting, Churchill told the cabinet. We should be rid of a bad man and an enemy of the empire if he died. He was quite prepared to facilitate the process, suggesting that the Mahatma should be bound hand and foot at the gates of Delhi, and let the viceroy sit on the back of a giant elephant and trample the Mahatma into the dirt. What became Nehru's longest spell in prison, a total of 1,040 days, or over 34 months, from August 9, 1942 to June 13, 1943, saw the British moving to strengthen the position of Jinnah and the Muslim League, pressuring Jinnah's critics within the party to remain in the League and under his leadership. Muslim opponents of the Pakistan idea were dissuaded or sidelined. Others who could have made a difference, like Sir Sikandar Hayat Khan in Punjab and Ullah Bucks in Sindh, died before they were able to influence the outcome. The League formed governments, often with the votes of British members, and with Congress legislators in jail, in provinces where it had been routed in the elections and enjoyed patronage appointments where formal office was not possible. In this effort, the British were complicit, as Lord Linlithgow, Britain's viceroy during the fraught years of World War II, admitted of Jinnah. He represents a minority, and a minority that can only effectively hold its own with our assistance. As the League grew with British patronage, its membership swelled from 112,000 in 1941 to over 2 million members in 1944. The futility of the Quit India movement, which accomplished little but the Congress's own exclusion from national affairs, compounded the original blunder of the Congress in resigning its ministries. It had left the field free for the Muslim League, which emerged from the war immeasurably enhanced in power and prestige. Both the resignations of the Congress ministries in 1939 and the Quit India movement in 1942 turned out to be futile gestures of demonstrative rather than far-sighted politics. They paved the way for the triumph of the Muslim League. On June 13, 1943, Nehru and his Congress colleagues emerged from prison, blinking in the sunlight. The war was over, and they had been freed. But they would be taking their first steps in, and towards, freedom in a world that had changed beyond recognition. Endgame, election, revolt, division. The British had not covered themselves with glory during the war. They had run a military dictatorship in a country that they had claimed to be preparing for democracy. They had presided over one of the worst famines in human history, the Bengal famine of 1943, while diverting food, on Churchill's personal orders, from starving civilians to well-supplied Tommies. More on this in the next chapter. Even Lord Wavell, who had been rewarded for military failure, in both the deserts of North Africa and the jungles of Burma, by succeeding Linlithgow as viceroy, considered the British government's attitude to India negligent, hostile and contemptuous to a degree I had not anticipated. The Labour victory in the British general election of 1943 meant that the egregious Churchill was soon to be replaced as Prime Minister by Attlee, but this did not precipitate any change in the anti-Congressism of the British authorities in India. Wavell convened a conference in Simla from late June 1943, which the Viceroy allowed Jinnah to wreck. In this atmosphere of frustration and despair, the British called elections in India at the end of 1943, for seats in the central and provincial assemblies. The Congress was woefully unequipped to contest them. Its blunder in surrendering the reins of power in 1939 and then losing its leadership and cadres to prison from 1942 meant that it went into the campaign tired, dispirited and ill-organized. The League, on the other hand, had flourished during the war, its political machinery was well oiled with patronage and pelf, while the Congress's was rusty from disuse. The electoral fortunes of 1935 were now significantly reversed. The Congress still carried a majority of the provinces. But except for the Northwest Frontier Province, where the Congress won 19 Muslim seats to the League's 17, the League swept the reserved seats for Muslims across the board, even in provinces like Bombay and Madras, which had seemed immune to the communal contagion. Whatever the explanation, and Nehru could have offered a few, there was no longer any escaping the reality that Jinnah and the Muslim League could now legitimately claim a popular mandate to speak for the majority of India's Muslims. Nehru did not believe that this meant that the partition of the country, which he thought totally impractical, was inevitable. In speeches, interviews, and articles throughout late 1943 and early 1946, he expressed the belief that, free of foreign rule, the Muslims of India would relinquish any thought of secession. The Muslims of India, he wrote, are only technically a minority. They are vast in numbers and powerful in other ways, and it is patent that they cannot be coerced against their will. This communal question is essentially one of protection of vested interests, and religion has always been a useful stalking horse for this purpose. He even argued that Congress should grant the right of secession just to allay any Muslim fears, not in the expectation that the Muslim League-ruled provinces would actually exercise it. But whether, as many Indian analysts have suggested, Jinnah had really meant to establish a separate state or was merely advocating Pakistan to obtain leverage over the Congress, his followers had taken him at his word. A state of their own was what they were determined to have, and by the spring of 1946 Nehru's idealism appeared naive, even dangerously so. Tragically, divide et impera had worked too well. A device to maintain the integrity of British India had made it impossible for that integrity to be maintained without the British. Britain's time in India was almost up. Even Indian soldiers and policemen openly expressed their support for the nationalist leaders, heedless of the reaction of their British officers. Mutinies broke out in the Air Force and the British Indian Navy. The latter was serious, affecting 78 ships and 20 shore establishments, involving 20,000 naval personnel. Violence erupted at political events. In one incident in Bombay, 233 demonstrators were killed by British soldiers putting down an anti-British riot. The demand for freedom was all but drowned out by the clamor for partition. In a gesture so counterproductive that it could almost have been an act of expiation, the Raj clumsily gave the warring factions a last chance of unity. It decided to prosecute the defectors of Bose's Indian National Army. Bose himself had died in a fiery plane crash at war's end in Formosa, Taiwan, so the Raj sought to find scapegoats amongst his lieutenants. In a desire to appear even-handed, the British chose to place 3 INA soldiers on trial in Delhi's historic Red Fort, a Hindu, a Muslim, and a Sikh. The result was a national outcry that spanned the communal divide. Whatever the errors and misjudgments of the INA men, and Nehru believed freedom could never have come through an alliance with foreigners, let alone foreign fascists, they had not been disloyal to their motherland. Each of the 3 defendants became a symbol of his community's proud commitment to independence from alien rule. Both the Congress and the League rose to the trio's defense. For the first time in their long careers, Nehru and Jinnah accepted the same brief, Nehru donning a barrister's gown after 25 years. But the moment passed, the defense of 3 patriots was no longer enough to guarantee a common definition of patriotism. The ferment across the country made the result of the trials almost irrelevant. The trials were eventually abandoned because by the time they had begun it was apparent that the ultimate treason to the British Raj was being contemplated in its own capital. London, under the Labour Party, exhausted by war, was determined to rid itself of the burdens of its Indian empire. In February 1946, Prime Minister Attlee announced the dispatch of a cabinet mission to India to discuss with leaders of Indian opinion the framing of an Indian constitution. The endgame had begun. In April 1946, Nehru was elected unopposed as President of the Congress, with an interim Indian government being formed in advance of talks with the cabinet mission in Simla in May. The mission, a triumvirate of Sir Stafford Cripps, Lord Pethick Lawrence and A.V. Alexander, was besieged. The vultures, sensing that the Raj was close to its end, began gathering for the feast. The negotiations and confabulations, intrigue and maneuvering amongst and within the various interested parties, the British, the Congress, the Muslim League, the Hindu Mahasabha, the Loyalists, the Communists, the civil servants, became more intense and more convoluted with each passing day. Wavell's astonishingly candid diaries reveal his distaste for, and distrust of, practically every Indian politician he had to deal with, each, in his eyes, proving more dishonest than the next. Though he was, like most of the British administration, hostile to the Congress and sympathetic to the League his government had helped nurture, he was scathing in his contempt for the mendacity of the League's leaders, and of their hymn of hate against Hindus. No Congress leader expressed any hatred of Muslims to the Viceroy. Even the idea of Pakistan seemed to take many forms in the minds of its own advocates, with several seeing it as a Muslim state within a united India, and others advocating assorted forms of decentralized confederation rather than outright secession. The American journalist Phillips Talbot told me of Sir Abdullah Haroon of the League showing him, in 1940, 8 separate plans for Pakistan then being debated by the League's high command. Jinnah was steadfast in his demand for a separate state in the northwest and east of the country, but avoided giving specific answers as to how the creation of such a state could serve its declared purpose of protecting Muslims in the Hindu-majority provinces. Nehru, meanwhile, sought nothing less than an act of abdication from the British. India's political arrangements should, he declared, be left to Indians to determine in their own constituent assembly, free of British mediation. Part of the problem at the time may well have lain in a profound miscalculation on Nehru's part about the true intentions of the British. Cut off by imprisonment from the political realities of world affairs, Nehru came to Simla believing, as he asserted to Phillips Talbot, that perfidious Albion was still trying to hold on to her prized imperial possession by encouraging division amongst the Indian parties. Talbot felt that Nehru had simply not realized that Britain was exhausted, near bankrupt, unwilling and unable to dispatch the 60,000 British troops the government in London estimated would be required to reassert its control in India. London wanted to cut and run, and if the British could not leave behind a united India, they were prepared to cut the country quite literally before running. Nehru, still imagining an all-powerful adversary seeking to perpetuate its hegemony, and unaware of the extent to which the League had become a popular party amongst Indian Muslims, dealt with both on erroneous premises. How differently would Nehru and his colleagues have negotiated, Talbot wondered, had they understood Britain's weakness rather than continuing to be obsessed with its presumed strength? The question haunts our hindsight. When the Simla Conference began on May 9, 1946, Jinnah, who was cool but civil to Nehru, refused to shake hands with either of the two Muslim congressmen, Maulana Azad or Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. He wished to be seen as the sole spokesman of Muslim India. Nonetheless, when the cabinet mission proposed a three-tier plan for India's governance, with a weak centre, limited to defence, external affairs, and communications, autonomous provinces, with the right of secession after 5 years, and groups of provinces, at least one of which would be predominantly Muslim. The League accepted the proposal, even though it meant giving up the idea of a sovereign Pakistan. The Viceroy, without waiting for the Congress's formal acceptance of the scheme, invited 14 Indians to serve as an interim government. While most of the leading Muslim leaguers and congressmen were on the list, there was a startling omission. Not a single Muslim congressman had been invited to serve. The Congress replied that it accepted the plan in principle, but could not agree to a government whose Muslim members were all from the League. Jinnah made it clear he could not accept anything else, and the resultant impasse proved intractable. The cabinet mission left for London with its plan endorsed, but this dispute unresolved, leaving a caretaker Viceroy's Council in charge of the country. Ironically, its only Indian member, along with 7 Englishmen, was a Muslim civil servant, Sir Akbar Hydari, who had made clear his fundamental opposition in principle to the idea of Pakistan. Meanwhile, the problem of the cabinet mission's proposed government remained to be addressed. Both Congress and the League had accepted the plan in principle, the details were yet to be agreed upon. Nehru, newly restored to the presidency of the Congress, chaired a meeting of the AICC in Bombay at which he rashly interpreted Congress's acceptance of the plan as meaning that, "We are not bound by a single thing except that we have decided to go into the Constituent Assembly." The implications of his statement were still being parsed when he repeated it at a press conference immediately afterwards, adding that, "We are absolutely free to act." Nehru stated specifically that he did not think the grouping of provinces, so important to the League, would necessarily survive a free vote. An incensed Jinnah reacted by withdrawing the League's acceptance of the cabinet mission plan. Nehru was widely blamed for his thoughtlessness in provoking the end of the brief hope of Congress, League cooperation in a united Indian government, even on the League's terms. But even had Nehru held his tongue in July 1946, it is by no means clear that a common Congress, League understanding would have survived. Azad had been willing to relinquish the claims of Muslim congressmen to office in the interests of unity, but the party as a whole was not prepared to concede the point to Jinnah. In stating that the grouping of provinces was not immutable, Nehru was echoing the letter of the plan if not its spirit. The League could have been accused of doing the same thing when it declared that the plan gave it the basis to work for Pakistan. To see him as wrecker-in-chief of the country's last chance at avoiding partition is, therefore, to overstate the case. As his biographer M. J. Akbar put it, Pakistan was created by Jinnah's will and Britain's willingness, not by Nehru's willfulness. On August 8, 1946, the Congress Working Committee, bolstered by the admission of fresh faces appointed by the new president, including 2 relatively youthful women, Kamladevi Chattopadhyay and Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, declared that it accepted the cabinet mission plan with its own interpretations on issues of detail. But this was not enough to bring Jinnah back into the game. Nehru met with him, at Jinnah's home in Bombay, to seek agreement on an interim government, but Jinnah proved obdurate. He was determined to obtain Pakistan. The Muslim League leader declared August 16, 1946 as Direct Action Day, to drive home this demand. Thousands of Muslim Leaguers took to the streets in an orgy of violence, looting, and mayhem, and 16,000 innocents were killed in the resulting clashes, particularly in Calcutta. The police and army stood idly by. It seemed the British had decided to leave their former imperial capital to the mob. 3 days of communal rioting in the city left death and destruction in their wake before the army finally stepped in. But the carnage and hatred had also ripped apart something indefinable in the national psyche. Reconciliation now seemed impossible. Yet a week later Wavell and Nehru were discussing the composition of an interim government for India, to consist of 5 caste Hindus, 5 Muslims, a scheduled caste member, and 3 minority representatives. They agreed that Jinnah could nominate his representatives but could have no say in the Congress's nominations, including, in principle, of a nationalist Muslim. Though the League was still deliberating about whether to join, an interim government of India was named, and its Congress members sworn in, on September 2, 1946. Nehru, in a broadcast on September 5, saw this as the culmination of a long struggle. Too long have we been passive spectators of events, the playthings of others. The initiative comes to our people now, and we shall make the history of our choice. But the British remained supportive of the League and of its government in Bengal, which had allowed the horrors of Direct Action Day to occur. What is the good of our forming the interim government of India? Nehru wrote indignantly to Wavell about conditions in Bengal in the wake of the Calcutta killings, if all that we can do is to watch helplessly and do nothing else when thousands of people are being butchered. But he went too far in insisting upon visiting the overwhelmingly Muslim, though Congress ruled, Northwest Frontier Province. The British connived in League-organized demonstrations against him at which stones were flung and Nehru was bruised. More importantly, the fiasco suggested that Nehru, as a Hindu, could never be acceptable to the province's Muslims as a national leader. Meanwhile, British pressure on Congress to make more concessions to Jinnah in order to secure the League's entry into the interim government prompted Gandhi and Nehru to relinquish voluntarily their right to nominate a Muslim member. This had been a deal-breaker for Jinnah, and he now seemed ready, in discussions with Nehru, to find a compromise. But after their talks had made headway, Jinnah once again insisted that Congress recognize the League as the sole representative of Indian Muslims. Nehru refused to do this, saying it would be tantamount to a betrayal of the many nationalist Muslims in Congress, and a stain on his own as well as the country's honor. The Viceroy thereupon went behind the Congress's back and negotiated directly with Jinnah, accepting his nominations of Muslims as well as of a scheduled caste member. On October 13, the Muslim League formally announced that it would join the interim government. But the League had done so only to wreck it from within. Even before its nominees were sworn in on the 26th, they had made speeches declaring their real intention to be to work for the creation of Pakistan. The League's members met by themselves separately prior to each cabinet meeting and functioned in cabinet as an opposition group, rather than as part of a governing coalition. On every issue, from the most trivial to the most important, the League members sought to obstruct the government's functioning, opposing every Congress initiative or proposal. Meanwhile, the party continued to instigate violence across the country, as riots broke out in Bihar in early November, with Gandhi walking through the strife-torn province single-handedly restoring calm. Jinnah declared on November 14 that the killing would not stop unless Pakistan was created. The British convened talks in London in December to press the Congress to make further concessions to the League in order to persuade it to attend the Constituent Assembly. Nehru, still burned by the reaction to his Bombay press conference, was at his most conciliatory. But Jinnah saw in the British position confirmation that his party's fortunes were in the ascendant, and escalated his demands. To Nehru, it seemed the British had learned nothing from the failure of the policy of appeasement in Europe in the 1930s. The Constituent Assembly met as scheduled on December 9, without League participation. but was careful not to take any decisions that might alienate Jinnah. Nonetheless, on January 29, 1945, the Muslim League Working Committee passed a resolution asking the British government to declare that the Cabinet Mission Plan had failed, and to dissolve the Assembly. The Congress members of the interim government, in turn, demanded that the League members, having rejected the plan, resign. Amid the shambles of their policy, the British government announced that they would withdraw from India, come what may, no later than June 1948, and that to execute the transfer of power, Wavell would be replaced. Into the midst of this stalemate came His Excellency Rear Admiral the Right Honourable Lord Louis Francis Albert Victor Nicholas, Viscount Mountbatten of Burma, KCG, PC, GCSI, GCIE, GCVO, KCB, DSO, the outgoing Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia. A blue-blooded patrician of royal lineage, Queen Victoria was his great-grandmother, and he was therefore the reigning monarch's cousin. Mountbatten was also vain, charming, superficial, and impulsive. "I've never met anyone more in need of front-wheel brakes," his own chief of staff, General Ismay, admitted. Sadly, such brakes were what India needed as it plunged headlong into disaster. 2 surrenders, the British give up and the Congress gives in. It was now increasingly apparent even to Nehru that Pakistan, in some form, would have to be created. The League was simply not going to work with the Congress in a united government of India. He nonetheless tried to prod leaders of the League into discussions on the new arrangements, which he still hoped would fall short of an absolute partition. By early March, as communal rioting continued across northern India, even this hope had faded. Both Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel and Nehru agreed that, despite Gandhi's refusal to contemplate such a prospect, the Congress had no alternative but to agree to partitioning Punjab and Bengal, the option of a loose Indian Union, including a quasi-sovereign Pakistan, would neither be acceptable to the League nor result in a viable government for the rest of India. By the time Mountbatten arrived on March 24, 1945, the die had been cast. It was he, however, who rapidly ended the game altogether. Mountbatten later claimed he governed by personality, and indeed, both his positive and negative attributes would prove decisive. On the one hand, he was focused, energetic, charming, and free of racial bias, unlike almost every one of his predecessors. On the other, he was astonishingly vain, alarmingly impatient, and easily swayed by personal likes and dislikes. His vicereine, Edwina, was a vital partner, one who took a genuine interest in Indian affairs. Theirs was a curious marriage, marked by her frequent infidelities, which he condoned, and it has been suggested that her affection for Nehru played a part in some of his, and Mountbatten's, decisions relating to Indian independence. There is no question that Nehru and Edwina indeed became close, but it does not seem likely that this had any political impact. Meanwhile, the breakdown of governance in India was gathering pace. Communal violence and killings were a daily feature, so was Jinnah's complete unwillingness to cooperate with the Congress on any basis other than that it represented the Hindus, and he the Muslims of India. The British gave him much encouragement to pursue this position. The governor of the Northwest Frontier Province, the pro-League Sir Olaf Carow, was unconscionably pressing the Congress government of this Muslim-majority state to make way for the League, since its continuation would have made Pakistan impossible. As the impasse in the interim government continued, Mountbatten and his advisers drew up a Plan Balkan that would have transferred power to the provinces rather than to a central government, leaving them free to join a larger union, or not. The British kept Nehru in the dark while Plan Balkan was reviewed, and revised, in London, All the more ironic for an empire that liked to claim it had unified India. When he was finally shown the text by Mountbatten at Simla on the night of May 10, Nehru erupted in indignation, storming into his friend Krishna Menon's room at 2 a.m. to sputter his outrage. Had the plan been implemented, the idea of India that Nehru had so brilliantly evoked in his writings would have been sundered even more comprehensively than Jinnah was proposing. Balkanization would have unleashed civil war and disorder on an unimaginable scale, as provinces, princely states, and motley political forces contended for power upon the departure of the Raj. A long, passionate, and occasionally incoherent note of protest from Nehru to Mountbatten killed the plan. But the only alternative was partition. In May, Nehru saw the unrest in the country as volcanic. The time had come for making hard and unpleasant choices, and he was prepared to make them. Reluctantly, he agreed to Mountbatten's proposal for a referendum in the northwest frontier province, and in the Muslim-majority district of Sylhet, gave in on a Congress counterproposal for a similar approach in regard to Hindu-majority districts of Sindh, and most surprisingly, agreed to dominion status for India within the British Commonwealth, rather than the full independence the Congress had long stood for. As long as the British gave Jinnah a veto over every proposal he found uncongenial, and as long as they were about to give up the ghost, there was little else Nehru could do but give in to partition. Nor is there evidence in the writings and reflections of the other leading Indian nationalists of the time that any of them had any better ideas. The only exception was Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi went to Mountbatten and suggested that India could be kept united if Jinnah were offered the leadership of the whole country. Nehru and Patel both gave that idea short shrift, and Mountbatten did not seem to take it seriously. There is no doubt that Mountbatten seemed to proceed with unseemly haste, picking a much earlier date than planned, August 13, a date he chose on a whim because it was the date he had accepted the Japanese surrender as Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia, and that in so doing he swept the Indian leaders along. Nehru was convinced that Jinnah was capable of setting the country ablaze and destroying all that the nationalist movement had worked for. A division of India was preferable to its destruction. "It is with no joy in my heart that I commend these proposals," Nehru told his party, "though I have no doubt in my mind that it is the right course." The distinction between heart and head was poignant and telling. On June 3, Nehru, Jinnah, and the Sikh leader Baldev Singh broadcast news of their acceptance of partition to the country. The occasion again brought out the best in Nehru. "We are little men serving a great cause," he said. "Mighty forces are at work in the world today and in India. It is my hope that in this way we shall reach that united India sooner than otherwise, and that she will have a stronger and more secure foundation. The India of geography, of history and tradition, the India of our minds and hearts, cannot change. But of course, it could change. Geography was to be hacked, history misread, tradition denied, minds and hearts torn apart." Nehru imagined that the rioting and violence that had racked the country over the League's demand for Pakistan would die down once that demand had been granted, but he was wrong. The killing and mass displacement worsened as people sought frantically to be on the right side of the lines the British were to draw across their homeland. Over 1 million people died in the savagery that bookended the freedom of India and Pakistan, some 15 million were displaced, and countless properties were destroyed and looted. Lines meant lives. What Nehru had thought of as a temporary secession of certain parts of India hardened into the creation of two separate and hostile states that would fight 4 wars with each other and be embroiled in a nuclear-armed, terrorism-torn standoff decades later. Gandhi was not the only one to be assailed by a sense of betrayal. The Congress government in the Northwest Frontier Province, let down by the National Party, chose to boycott the referendum there, which passed with the votes of just 30.49% of the electorate, but nearly 99% of those who voted. Mountbatten, who had seen himself serving for a while as a bridge between the two new dominions by holding the governor-generalship of both, was brusquely told by Jinnah that the League leader himself would hold that office in Pakistan. The outgoing viceroy would therefore have to content himself with the titular overlordship of India alone. Amidst the rioting and carnage that consumed large sections of northern India, Jawaharlal Nehru found the time to ensure that no pettiness marred the moment. He dropped the formal lowering of the Union Jack from the independence ceremony in order not to hurt British sensibilities. The Indian tricolour was raised just before sunset, and as it fluttered up the flagpole, a late monsoon rainbow emerged behind it, a glittering tribute from the heavens. Just before midnight, Nehru rose in the Constituent Assembly to deliver the most famous speech ever made by an Indian. Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. A moment comes, which comes but rarely in history, when we step out from the old to the new, when an age ends, and when the soul of a nation long suppressed finds utterance. There were no harsh words for the British, whose Raj was ending at midnight. "This is no time for ill will or blaming others," he added. "We have to build the noble mansion of free India where all her children may dwell. Quitting India, creating Pakistan." In that last mad headlong rush to freedom and partition, the British emerge with little credit. Before the war, they had no intention of devolving power so rapidly, or at all. The experience of the elected governments in the last years of the Raj confirmed that the British had never been serious about their proclaimed project of promoting the responsible governance of India by Indians. When the Congress ministries quit, the British thought little of appointing unelected Muslim Leaguers in their place and in many cases assuming direct control of functions that had supposedly been devolved to Indians. The British, who had been dismayed by the League's inability to win a majority of Muslim seats anywhere, thereby undermining the strength of divide and rule, welcomed the opportunity to assume the power they had partly ceded and to shore up the League as the principal alternative to the Indian National Congress in the process. They openly helped the Muslim League take advantage of this unexpected opportunity to exercise influence and patronage that their electoral support had not earned them, and to build up support while their principal opponents languished in jail. This was all part of official policy. No one in any responsible position in London or New Delhi, as late as 1940, had any serious intention whatsoever of relinquishing the empire or surrendering India to a rabble of nationalists clad in homespun. But the devastation of World War II meant that only one half of the phrase could survive. Bled, bombed, and battered for 6 years, Britain could divide, but it could no longer rule. The British, terrorized by German bombing, demoralized by various defeats and large numbers of their soldiers taken prisoner, shaken by the desertion of Indian soldiers and the mutiny of Indian sailors, shivering in the record cold of the winter of 1943–46, crippled by power cuts and factory closures resulting from a post-war coal shortage, were exhausted and in no mood to focus on a distant empire when their own needs at home were so pressing. They were also more or less broke. American loans had kept the economy afloat and needed to be repaid, and even India was owed a sizable debt. Overseas commitments were no longer sustainable or particularly popular. Exit was the only viable option. The question was what they would leave behind: 1. India, 2. or several fragments. Britain's own tactics before and during the war, compounded, as we have seen, by the Congress's folly in relinquishing all its leverage and going to jail, ensured that by the time departure came, the prospects of a united India surviving a British exit had essentially faded. Divide et Impera had worked too well. Two Indias is what it would be. The task of dividing the two nations was assigned to Sir Cyril Radcliffe, a lawyer who had never been to India before and knew nothing of its history, society, or traditions. Radcliffe drew up his maps in 40 days, dividing provinces, districts, villages, homes, and hearts, and promptly scuttled home to Britain, never to return to India. The British Empire did not decline, it simply fell, as Alex von Tunzelmann put it. The British were heedless of the lives that would be lost in their headlong rush to the exits. So much has already been written about the tragic disruption of partition that it seems otiose to add new words to describe what has already been so devastatingly depicted by so many. It may suffice for now to quote the British Muslim scholar Yasmin Khan, in her well-regarded history, The Great Partition, The Making of India and Pakistan. Khan writes that partition stands testament to the follies of empire, which ruptures community evolution, distorts historical trajectories, and forces violent state formation from societies that would otherwise have taken different and unknowable paths. It is difficult, therefore, to buy the self-serving imperial argument that Britain bequeathed to India its political unity and democracy. Yes, it allied a variety of states under a system of common law and administration, but with a number of distortions, outlined in the previous chapters, occasioned by the fitful and hypocritical nature of British conquest and rule, and by the British determination to deny Indians the opportunity to exercise genuine political authority in representative institutions. Yes, it brought in a supposedly free press, but ensured it operated under severe constraints, and planted the seeds of representative parliamentary institutions while withholding the substance of power from Indians. Far from introducing democracy to a country mired in despotism and tyranny, as many Britons liked to pretend, it denied political freedom to a land that had long enjoyed it even under various monarchs, thanks to a cultural tradition of debate and dissent even on vital issues of spirituality and governance. Yes, India has emerged as a thriving pluralist democracy, though both Pakistan and Bangladesh have encountered difficulties in doing so, and Pakistan officially and undemocratically discriminates against its non-Muslim citizens even under civilian rule. But India's flourishing democracy of 7 decades is no tribute to British rule. It is a bit rich, as I pointed out in Oxford, for the British to suppress, exploit, imprison, torture, and maim a people for 200 years and then celebrate the fact that they are a democracy at the end of it. Finally, the most painful question of all: what political unity can we celebrate when the horrors of partition were the direct result of the deliberate British policy of communal division that fomented religious antagonisms to facilitate continued imperial rule? If Britain's greatest accomplishment was the creation of a single political unit called India, fulfilling the aspirations of visionary emperors from Ashoka to Akbar, then its greatest failure must be the shambles of that original Brexit, cutting and running from the land they had claimed to rule for its betterment, leaving behind 1 million dead, 13 million displaced, billions of rupees of property destroyed, and the flames of communal hatred blazing hotly across the ravaged land. No greater indictment of the failures of British rule in India can be found than the tragic manner of its ending.